the office. All right. Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukee Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the city website at www.milwaukeeoregon.gov. You may locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting page is posted. If you have not reviewed the agenda, please do. It contains important information about the process. First on the agenda is our minutes. Minutes from July 27th, 2021. Do any of the planning commissioners have corrections or comments to make about the minutes? I'm seeing no hands raised. Everybody's shaking head. All right. So I will then entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the meeting minutes as written for July 27th, 2021.
All right. We have a motion. All those, do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, seconded. And all those in favor? Raise hand. All in favor. Great. And I believe that's all the commissioners we have, so we'll have no opposed. Moving on then to informational items. Are there informational items from staff?
Not at this time. No, thank you, Chair Lisfeld.
Okay. Audience participation, I guess I'll first ask, do we have an audience this evening?
We do not. There are no attendees logged on tonight.
Okay, I'll skip audience participation then, and we'll just dive directly into our work session items. The first work session item tonight is a discussion of the draft on a comprehensive plan implementation project. Public Works Director Peter Pastorelli, excuse me. Is he on? Let's see. I don't see him.
No, Natalie Rogers is going to be presenting the tree code on his behalf tonight.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to ask if everyone can see it, and we'll go from there. Okay. All right. Can everyone see the presentation? Have that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, terrific. Okay, thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much. Vera Coley, Senior Planner, here with Natalie Rogers, our Climate and Natural Resources Manager. We're also going to be joined by Todd Prager, our consulting arborist on the tree code, and Marcy McAnally from HerbsWorks will be here as well to assist in this overall presentation for the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Project, batch number 3 set of amendments. I have a couple of sort of slides here just to kind of walk us through the project real quick. I can get to, there we go. We have a number of policy mandates from the comprehensive plan that inform this project, including increasing the supply of middle housing and to provide housing choice throughout the city, to increase the tree canopy and preserve existing trees, and to manage parking to enable middle housing and to protect those trees. As we talked about at a previous meeting, just wanted to again show the slide of the summary, rough summary of activities that we've undertaken over the last 13 months to let folks know what the project is about, to get feedback, and to just generally provide information and again seek feedback and comment on all of these, on all of the code amendments and the overall project itself. I'm not going to read this list, but as you can see, we've been working diligently again over the last more than 13 months to get the word out. And to make sure that folks are aware of the project and have the opportunity to participate. This being the third of our work sessions, I also just wanted to dovetail that, that slide with what we're doing for the public hearings that are starting in the fall. So we've worked through kind of what we'll be doing to make sure that the word gets out for the public hearings and for public comment. So you can see here on this list that next week we'll be posting the required 35-day public notice of the final draft code that will be, or the hearing code, I will call it, the hearing version of the code. We will be updating all of our project web pages. We'll be doing email blasts. So apologies in advance if you get more than one email from me about the code and about the public notice. We will be posting an executive summary of the code that was discussed at a prior meeting from the commission. That was a great idea. And we'll be using all of the city social media around that 35-day public notice. We will be sending out a 20-day notice, and that is a direct mail through the U.S. mail postcard will be sent to all residential properties about the code. So everyone will get a hand-delivered postcard as well, letting folks know about the code amendments. And again, another email blast about the 20-day notice. Staff will be at the farmers market towards the end of September, and we'll also be making a presentation to the Rotary Club at the end of September as well, in advance of the first hearing in October. We will be making presentations or submitting materials to all of the NDAs in September. There will be a pilot newsletter article in October, and then there is some tree code outreach and education materials that are being planned for the fall and the winter, and Natalie can talk about that if she has some more details. So I just wanted to summarize what we're doing, and this is all in advance of the public hearing in October. Are there any questions about the okay piece that I've just very quickly blown through for the commission? Okay. All right. And again, for this review schedule that we've had with the work sessions with the commission, we're now on for tonight. So we'll be talking about the tree code, and then we'll be focusing on the design and the development standards for middle housing. Okay. Take it away, Natalie.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Natalie Rogers. I'm the Climate Action, my title changed, Climate and Natural Resources Manager. I'm now managing not only our Climate Action Plan, but I also manage our natural resource team here at the city. And one of the projects that we've been working on is tree code. So, the origins of tree code and kind of the interest behind tree code and our tree preservation goals really was formalized with the 2017 community vision. Trees are called out in multiple areas in the community vision, both naturing a verdant canopy of trees in Milwaukee, but then as well as recognizing the ecological benefits on riparian corridors and such. After the community vision, we had the Milwaukee Climate Action Plan, which was adopted in 2018. The Climate Action Plan set out in our natural resources section a 40% canopy goal to reach by 2040. And that was based off of the American Forest Institute suggestion that cities aim for 40%. They've now revised that recommendation to better reflect the historical ecosystems found in each community. And seeing as Milwaukee was once completely forested as a temperate rainforest, I think 40% is still a great goal for us to try to reach. In 2019, we had the Urban Forest Management Plan adopted, and this was really a guide to help us reach that 40% canopy goal. And within our Urban Forest Management Plan, tree code was called out as a strategy to both preserve trees as well as increase our plantings, as 80% of our community's canopy cover is on private property. In 2020, we had our comprehensive plan adopted, which calls out many natural resource and tree-related goals and policies for the city of Milwaukee. Since the adoption of all of these documents, we have adopted a public tree code. And that code regulates trees on our right-of-way and in public properties. So that's park trees as well as street trees. But what we're missing is the private side. Like I mentioned, 80% of our canopy is on private property. And without any sort of assistance to those trees, there's likely no way that we'd be able to reach the 40% goal that our community set out to achieve. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. And I forgot to introduce Courtney Wilson today is actually on the call. She's our new urban forester for the city of Milwaukee. I won't make her show turn off the camera, but if folks have questions about tree canopies or the city's tree goals or any questions related to trees and urban forests within the city, I really urge you to reach out to Courtney, and she's great, and I'm really happy to have her on our team. So anyway, so for the updates to the code that we're proposing, this really is related to residential development and residential non-development. So this is not addressing commercial and industrial properties yet. So the goal of these code amendments are to improve alignment with the vision and goal documents that I just talked about. There's new standards that are established for the residential development portion of the private tree code. There's tree preservation standards, mitigation standards, canopy standards, tree protection standards, and soil volume standards. And I'll run through each of these and give you a summary of what they contain. We also update the definitions within our tree code, and that's to better reflect common definitions and terminology used within the ISA, the International Society of Arboricultural Practice, but then also to better align it with our public tree code as well. And then we also establish permitting requirements for non-development properties. So that's tree removal and major pruning permits on private property. And there's review criteria and approval standards for those, but it's much more streamlined. And then there's removal fees, healthy tree removal fees associated with that. And one thing I do like to highlight too is that we are proposing low income assistance, because we know that canopy and equity goes hand in hand, and we don't want income to be a barrier to tree plantings and preservation. And today, as Vera mentioned, Todd Prager from Tarragon Associates is here. He helped us draft this code. He is an expert in code writing. I feel like he knows every city's code in and out. So I'm happy to have him here to help me answer some of your hard questions if you have them. So to start out for tree preservation. So essentially the way I like to view this is that tree preservation standards is looking at the trees itself. Right. And so we're establishing tree preservation standards to protect the existing trees on site. These trees have been there for potentially decades. It takes a lot of investment of resources to grow a tree. We want to make sure that these trees, which provide the maximum benefits to our community, stay within our community. So trees are prioritized in our preservation standards based on their native and climate adapted status. This is recognizing that not every tree is created equal. There are certain situations where one tree should be prioritized over another tree because either it's well suited to the climate that we're in currently, or it's providing habitat for our current ecosystem, but then also there's benefits to being climate adapted, meaning that it's going to be well suited for our future climate, considering climate change will be increasing the amount of very hot and dry summers that we're seeing. And the big goal over all of these prioritization and in different categories is to achieve a healthy, diverse, and climate adapted urban forest. Urban forests and forests in general really benefit from diversity in their species, and that also increases resiliency. So priority tree species are required to be preserved, exception for when removal is required for development and no alternatives are available. If removal is required, the private tree code would establish a maximum percentage of tree canopy removed, and that's our canopy standards, unless mitigation is performed, so our mitigation standards. So no more than 33% of the trees on priority trees on site can be removed without paying mitigation fees. And so this essentially establishes that maximum amount of canopy or trees and their canopy that can be removed without having to pay for some additional mitigation. And this is recognizing that there are likely going to be situations where tree removal is required to build on a site. And so this is kind of that way that we're finding that balance. There are also discretionary alternatives, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Are there any questions on the tree preservation standards so far? Oh, that's okay, Vera, you can switch to the next slide. Okay, great.
I'm sorry, can I ask a real quick question, Natalie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
When you say mitigation fees, does that mean planting more trees Is that a fee or is it just pay into a pot for something?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for planting, that's really tied to our canopy standards, which I'll talk about next. So there are planting requirements to plant up to a certain canopy, that 40% canopy goal that we have. And all of the fees for mitigation, if you're only paying them if you can't meet the standards that we're setting out. So both our preservation and our canopy standards. And those fees are going into a tree fund, which is going to be used to pay for urban forest related programming, staffing, et cetera. And that could be potentially community planting programs around Milwaukee. We haven't necessarily defined what those programs would be coming from the tree fund, but they would just have to be related to the benefit of our urban forest. Great question. And Vera, I don't know if you're perfect. So what I really wanted to show you right here, so this is a graphic that was created by our tree board to really kind of illustrate how choosing, prioritizing certain species for either their species or their diameter or their health can lead to different results. And you might not necessarily want to pick one, like for example, DBH, diameter at breast height, as your prioritization when building. So if you can see on the left here, if we're only looking at the canopy size, so that's, you know, if we're looking at these dots, essentially the larger the dot is going to be the larger the diameter at breast height of your tree. So the larger your tree and the larger the canopy. If we were looking at only preserving trees of the largest canopy, you would end up saving that large red dot that you see on the center of the graphic. However, if those red dots represented the health of the tree, showing that those trees were in poor condition, you would be preserving the poor condition trees over the potentially better health, better suited species that are represented in green. If you're looking on the right, you can see that the green trees are prioritized rather than the red larger trees. And that actually might end up in a better, healthier canopy in the long run because you're prioritizing trees based on potentially their species and attributes besides size. So this is why we're kind of creating this tiered system of prioritization, but then also offering up some discretion through our urban forester to be able to work with the developer to really prioritize the trees that would benefit the community the most. And one thing that we will have to create are priority tree lists. And we're working right now with our urban forester to take a look at that and make sure that those lists reflect the trees that are well suited both now and in the future. Okay, go ahead, next slide, Vera. Great. So we were just talking about tree preservation standards, and that's really looking at our existing trees and saying that you can't remove more than 33% of the existing trees. Now we have canopy standards as well, and this really relates to that question that Commissioner Hemer posed around planting. So our goal as a community is to reach 40% canopy cover. And that's because the shading effects of trees really benefit us in urban heat islands, meaning that cities are warmer, disproportionately warmer than our maybe less developed regions outside cities. There's also community benefits for trees, both mental health, physical health, and then it's also called out explicitly in our climate action plan and comprehensive plan. So we have this 40% goal, and so we want to ensure that private properties reflect that 40% goal as well, particularly in development situations where we're really taking a site level approach. So the canopy standards ensure that there's intentional preservation and planting on development sites. So what this means is that through both preservation of existing tree canopy as well as plantings, new plantings, we reach that 40% canopy goal. And so when we're doing new plantings, we're calculating that canopy goal based on the size of canopy at maturity. And that makes it so that we have this forward thinking approach, so that in 2040, we're really considering what the size of the canopy would be, even if they are young trees planted on the site today. If we can't reach that 40% canopy goal through a combination of preservation of existing trees as well as new plantings, that's when mitigation is performed or mitigation fees are paid. So we have tree preservation, so no more than 33%, and then canopy standards mean that you have to plant up to at least that 40%. Yeah.
Natalie, I have a question.
Sorry.
This is Lauren. Sorry,
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Does that number also account for some kind of assumption where you could anticipate die-off from new trees, or, you know, those challenging first couple of years as they're establishing themselves? I do recall, it might have been a couple of years now, we had a really passionate member of our community come to one of our hearings and specifically speak about developers, you know, planting trees that often die within a year, and was really advocating for stronger code requirements around developments and how trees are established.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a few things that we're doing to address that. The first is when we're having so we have tree protection or standards essentially that set up construction requirements, both soil volume standards, but then also construction site standards, so that, you know, you're not running a heavy equipment over sensitive root structure on a tree, or you're not, you know, planting trees in too small of soil volume areas, really setting them up for failure in the long run. There's also a level of approval that our urban forester will need to do in terms of selecting the right tree species for the right place. So that way, if they see on a development plan the idea to plant, say, you know, a giant sequoia right underneath a power line, you know, they're going to be offering up recommendations to change that species. You know, and another thing is, you know, we've talked about the idea of a bonding opportunity. So essentially, you're, you know, ensuring that the tree will be protected or at least grow to a healthy side or succeed for a few years. We haven't really explored that more besides in concept, but I don't know if other communities have a similar thing. And maybe this is a great question for Todd to jump in and answer.
Yeah, that is a common thing in other communities where there is a bonding requirement and an inspection after typically 2 years, maybe 3 years, to have the developer pay a bond, and it's not released until the trees are inspected and they're rooted in and thriving during that establishment period. Because the first certainly 3 years is critical for tree establishment. One other, and that's usually going to be a non-code item, so something that can be put in a condition of approval or a city practice that the city would have authority to do and write up standards for those types of things. So it wasn't something that was that we felt was really necessary to put in the actual code because it can be addressed in other ways. And then one thing that I wanted to point out was that the tree planting, if you're planting a new tree, the credit is 75% of its mature canopy, because I think it was the tree board wanted to kind of acknowledge that these trees aren't all going to survive, but to have a balance to not encourage overplanting. So if you gave, let's say, only 50% or 25% credit, then there would be incentive to plant way too many trees on the site, which can also be unhealthy. Because if all those trees survive, then the trees compete with each other and don't survive for the long run. So that's where the 75% landed on, as well as the soil volume aspect that Natalie talked about, because a lot of communities, and it's increasingly common that people are thinking about the soil environment and the rooting environment for trees, which can be a major factor in them not surviving. So this code and the tree board was really interested in making sure that the trees are going to be set up for success and have a proper rooting environment to be able to thrive for the long term.
And then just a follow-up question. I think it was 30%, 30% of the priority trees have to be maintained. Is that correct?
No more than 33% may be removed
Okay, and so
without
can you,
paying mitigation fees.
okay, so you can remove more than 33%, but then you trigger fees.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of have just a little bit of a rub there that you could just essentially pay more fees to take down more trees, and the value of the trees are here today, and the value of an established tree isn't realized for 20 years or more. So I just have a real rub with that condition personally, and I'd like to see us kind of get away from that. And then I'd just like to question, how did you come up with 33%? It seems pretty specific, so I just want to know why not, 20% or.
I think it was a recommendation from our tree board for the 33%. Is that right, Todd?
Yeah, there's a little bit of, I think a difference in recollection on that percentage. We had looked at other codes, and actually a lot of codes require preservation only at the 33% level, including Portland. So there wouldn't be mitigation until you're removing more than 66%, or you're preserving less than 33%, for example. So that's when mitigation would kick in, for example, in Portland. Other communities have similar standards. The tree board was interested, I think, in looking kind of the opposite way there and allowing no more than 33% removal. So actually, the standards are much higher than most communities in the region, or pretty much all communities in the region that I'm aware of, as far as where mitigation would kick in at a significant level.
I'm curious, do other commissioners have any heartache over that condition or any other comments to add there?
Commissioners Sherman and Massey both have their hands raised in Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Once again, I can't see if your hand is being raised through, so just speak up.
We'll be Vikings about it. Thanks, Chair Losfeld. I think just following up on the chair's kind of original question around performance bonds, I'd really like us to advocate for using that tool and maybe calling that tool out more explicitly in the code itself. It's referenced in a section as the city having that authority, but I think if we called it out more explicitly, it might help better set that expectation with the development community that they could expect these. Because I think, as we've kind of seen, I mean, the stormwater project right off of Railroad and Oak that happened last year, and that was the city's own project. I think about 50% of those trees died within a year. And I would like us to make sure that we're making sure that these trees can be established and make it through that kind of critical period. So that was kind of my feedback on that. As to your other question, Chair, I think that as Todd is maybe indicating, maybe these are some really forward-thinking approaches that the tree board has kind of recommended, and so I think I personally would probably go along with that recommendation in terms of those percentage figures.
Okay, I'm seeing some hand raised over here on the side here. So go ahead, Commissioner Massey.
Thank you. I'll direct this toward Natalie, but you can redirect it to whoever you think might best answer. So, I was just doing some, back of the envelope, calculations here. And so if we had a property that had the minimum, canopy cover of 40%, and it was allowed to reduce that by 33%, my simple math says you end up with a 26%, but I might be confusing the trees with the canopy. Would you clarify that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that there is a bit of a math equation that needs to happen. So they may not remove more than 33% of the trees, priority trees on the site without paying mitigation fees. Even if they say started with a 40% canopy cover, so canopy being the leaves and the branches and everything that extends over the tree, so that, which is in like a square footage type metric. If they remove 33% of their trees on the site and they say end up with 25% canopy, they still need to plant up to that 40% canopy to avoid paying mitigation fees. So they would likely have to plant new trees to replace the ones they removed. They might not be equivalent in number because they could potentially choose species that have a larger shading canopy, they might not be on the same location on the site. But they do have to reach that 40% mature canopy cover at the end in the calculation.
Just
So there's
one-
that,
Yeah.
sorry, there's that tree canopy portion, which is think about square footage of canopy cover. And then the priority trees are the trees themselves. And you can't remove no more than 33 of those individual trees without paying mitigation fees.
Just one quick question then. So is that square footage calculation just based on the drip line of the tree?
At maturity, yes, with a buffer in there to assume that not all of them are likely, the new plantings are likely to live to maturity.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Kashrabadi.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to echo actually what Chair Roosevelt said, the concern about that. I just don't want this to be a thing where it's like they just pay to get around it. So unless we make that fee, you know, pretty significant and hefty, you know, that's just my concern. I just don't want it to be where it's just like, all right, well, we'll just cut what we need and then pay the mitigation fee. So that's a little concerning to me. I don't know if I'm missing something on that, or is that kind of basically what it is?
Yeah, I think that this is something that staff have been trying to figure out how to balance along with the entire, comprehensive plan, middle housing parking update, which is how do we balance our tree preservation with the housing goals and the want to build more units and also need for parking. And so I think that Tree Board has expressed very similar concerns, and that developers will just pay to play, and they can take that financial hit in order to build more units. It's just one of those challenges that we're having to balance and figure out how we both encourage more units and creative development while also preserving trees on the site, particularly maybe if they're not well suited to a central unit or structure.
I also
would recommend your feedback and thoughts and suggestions on it.
Commissioner
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm a little fuzzy on this canopy thing. If I have a stand of firs on my site, right, or if I have a stand of maples, I would be able to remove much more maples because they have a larger canopy than I would a fir tree. No matter, right, because if we're talking about drip line, right, out to how far that the leaves extend. So a wider, broader leaf tree would be much more valuable than an old growth fir. Is that what I'm kind of understanding?
I believe you have them flipped, but yes, there's certain species that will have a larger canopy cover at maturity. So if you have 10 firs that are maybe more conical, they have a smaller canopy square footage coverage compared to 10 maples, which might have a wider canopy coverage. You can likely remove more of the firs and still be at that potentially 40% threshold than you would for maples. However, in both situations, you would need to hit that 40%, and you can only remove the 33% of those individual trees without having to pay mitigation fees. And that's why we have both the canopy coverage as well as the tree preservation standards working hand in hand. So that way we're both preserving priority tree species, regardless of if they're a conifer or a fir, but then we're also looking at that canopy coverage. Because you could also theoretically only plant, very either small or smaller canopied tree species, and then we would never reach our 40% canopy goal.
And so my follow-up question is who determines the canopy at the end or at the beginning? When you go, is there a mathematical formula? Do you just do it by Google Earth and then you wipe out a tree and see what the canopy is? Or does the arborist just walk out there and say, well, you can take out this one, that one, blah?
Yeah, great question. So there is an arborist report and tree inventory that is required when a developer is looking to develop a site. And part of that inventory is looking at both the DBH of a particular tree, but then also the canopy coverage for that site. And that can be calculated based on the drift line, which is where the edge of the leaf, sorry, I realize I'm not in Zoom, where the edge of the leaf hits essentially where that rain would drip off onto the ground, and then this the root structure underneath. So that's how you calculate an existing canopy coverage. And we're very fortunate in that there are many tree lists which can estimate trees at maturity for both urban environments as well as more rural environments. And so we can essentially use those estimated canopy coverage at maturity to calculate that canopy coverage in the future.
And I'm sorry, Commissioner Sherman, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to, the definition is 16-foot height. You keep using this diameter at breast height, the DBH.
Mm-hmm.
And so are we talking about mature trees, potential trees, trees that are 16-foot tall? Because in the definition, we use 16-foot tall as kind of a tree standard. So can you explain that maybe and how that all kind of works? Is it mature trees? Is it?
Yeah. I think if I'm understanding the question right, we define a tree as usually it's like a single or multi-stemmed vegetation that reaches 16 feet tall. And that's how we define a tree compared to tall vegetation or shrub. And I know that we had to modify that for the public tree code. Trees at maturity means the maximum size that tree is likely to grow based on how much carbon and wood that it can actually put on a particular tree. And that varies on the species. Some trees like giant sequoias, the size at maturity is massive compared to maybe a plum tree. When we're estimating canopy at maturity, we can look at a sapling sequoia that we just plant that's only about 5 feet tall, we'll say, and we can look up a list or a chart that shows what that canopy at maturity will be. And so that's how we're going to be estimating on the site with new plantings and existing trees, what that canopy at maturity would be. And that's why there's only a certain percentage that we're allotting for those new plants for canopy at maturity, that's 75%, because we're acknowledging that there's likely going to be less growth or some challenges for those trees being planted in an urban environment and on that site. And they're likely not going to reach that full mature canopy that the charts show. So if a maple could reach, I'm going to throw out a number, and our arborists are probably going to cringe on this call. If a maple reaches 500 square feet canopy at maturity, if we plant that in an urban environment, it's likely not going to reach that 500 square feet. It might reach something more like 450 or 400, just because there's more stressors for urban trees than there are for trees out in maybe more rural or more spacious areas. So hopefully that explains why there's different definitions and how they kind of all go hand in hand. But this is also why we're going to be working on outreach materials and educational materials for the community, because we know it's very confusing.
Commissioner Hamer, does that answer your questions? Good. Okay, Commissioner Sherman?
Thanks, Chair Losfeld. I know we're just kind of still getting into this work session, but Natalie, you kind of asked the question around prioritization and in response to kind of the conversation around developers and kind of pay to play. I think I just wanted to kind of make the note, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing from other commissioners, as we talk about housing and tree preservation and parking, I know that there are some members of this commission that have said, we think minimum parking requirements could be eliminated. in order to, better prioritize some of those other goals, especially knowing in our parking inventory study, we have ample supply of on-street parking in most parts of, in the parts of the city that were kind of sampled. I personally would be really interested in hearing maybe some arboreal expert opinion on that, especially when we were looking at that tree prioritization example. I was just kind of playing through in my own mind of what happens when you don't have to put a parking spot or a garage kind of on that site. So I just wanted to kind of mention that in response to your question around kind of prioritization.
Yeah, I would second that comment. I'd love to see some kind of ways to incentivize, excuse me, developers to do the right thing, homeowners to do the right thing. I just have one last question, and I'm not seeing anybody else with their hand raised. Maybe we can move on after this, but I know that you mentioned that the mediation, the cost was going to go towards supporting maybe staff or supporting and you had a short list of things there. I wonder if it had been considered whether that cost might go directly toward planting trees in other locations, maybe city-owned or in parks or in some of our underserved neighborhoods, rather than going towards staff or other things.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we've just really started to explore different programming and opportunities. Definitely, we would likely be using some of those funds to aid in our equitable tree planting initiatives. So we're looking at what community or what neighborhoods. I recommend folks go to trees.milwaukeeoregon.gov to access our Branch Out Milwaukee tool, which shows socioeconomic information with canopy coverage, so you can see which neighborhoods have less canopy coverage than others. But yes, definitely strategic tree plantings. I know that even Commissioner Sherman, before we had conversations about community arboretums. So that's something that we've floated around, tree plantings in both public property, but then also maybe we can offer up maintenance assistance, or maybe we can work with there's a great group called the Blueprint Foundation, which does green jobs training for BIPOC youth. And, that would be a great thing that we can maybe help them do some tree care and efforts around the city. So we've explored a whole bunch of different ways that we would want to use those funds that would both help us reach our 40% canopy goal, also help us with our climate and equity goals in the city. Great. Awesome questions, by the way. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so mitigation standards. So this is what, I've been alluding to. So essentially, if you're removing more than 33% of the individual trees on the site, priority trees, I should say. And then if you're removing, or if you're not meeting that 40% canopy coverage at the end, you need to pay mitigation fees. And these fees are associated with the diameter of the trees removed. So if you're removing more than 33% of the priority tree species, I believe it's the largest diameter tree that you're going to be removing, you have to pay relevant fees for. And then the total canopy percentage needed to meet that 40% standard. So those are how those fees are calculated, and those would be on our master fee schedule. There's also an opportunity for a discretionary alternative in lieu of mitigation fees. And this was kind of brought from our tree board, but then also our CPIC and other kind of community members' ideas on essentially how we can promote potentially sustainable design that doesn't maybe thrive under canopy. So that includes things like sustainable agriculture, community gardens, wildlife habitat enhancements, maybe renewable energy and energy efficiency beyond regulatory requirements on the buildings being constructed, minimization of hydrological impacts that essentially means like stormwater infrastructure, and other kind of stormwater and water mitigation and flooding mitigation design. and then alternative construction designs and techniques. So would be a discretionary alternative. And so this would likely require more review in the process. But it's something that we would definitely be encouraging folks to look at. And then go ahead and go to the next one. Perfect. And then tree protection standards. So this is where we get to making sure that the trees that remain on the site are going to be in healthy condition in the future. So tree protection standards are really important because construction practices that don't consider trees can lead to damaged roots. They can lead to soil compaction, which prevents growth in the future. It can constrict growth. And then other unintended impacts. Oftentimes we hear from tree board that trees are sometimes the last consideration on the site. And then even potentially you're left with, once you've constructed on a site, they ask, where can we plant a tree? And you're really left with nowhere because we didn't take the forethought to ensure that there would be a good planting area. So protection standards ensure that preserved trees are protected from development impacts. So there are some standards or requirements, including development of a tree protection plan, establishment of root protection zones, and you can see that there's also protection fencing requirements, and that's that fencing that's right around the drip line or a little bit beyond for certain trees. And then management of encroachment into root protection zones. And so oftentimes you can see this when you're on construction sites around the Portland metro area, because you'll be seeing a lot of fencing, a lot of silt fencing, or the orange kind of notice fencing around sites. And essentially it's, ensuring that they're not driving over roots. And then when the prescriptive path is not practicable, so these bullet points right above are the prescriptive path. When that's not practicable, meaning that maybe the site is too constrained, the applicant may propose alternative measures, but this requires guidance of an ISA certified arborist. So it's really ensuring that they're appropriate for the trees on site and they're not just kind of skirting the issue.
Natalie, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is this not typical practice? That's something that's would already be required by the jurisdiction? Are you saying that the city of Milwaukee doesn't require any of this today?
There are erosion control standards, which are related more like to water on the site and sediment control. But I do not believe that there are any standards, both state or federal, that require sites to be managed, at least for trees. And this would essentially be creating that. So, and Todd, correct me if I'm totally wrong, but.
Yeah, that's right. In Milwaukee right now, I'm not aware of specific tree protection standards. I've worked on several projects in Milwaukee and just used my best judgment on those, but there wasn't standards to point to, and I think it's really important to have that. And we talked to the previous urban forester who requested that there be standards in place that can be pointed to by the city. And most cities that have a tree, certainly a tree preservation requirement, also have a protection requirement so that the roots aren't damaged and construction doesn't impact the trees. So, but outside of any city regulation yet, Natalie's right, there's no state or federal or other requirement. So it falls upon the city to create those standards.
Okay, thank you.
I may ask a question on this. What happens is during our planning commission, we have a report from the developer or the builder that gives what they think that the tree root is. And then we have somebody that the city hires to give their estimate. Who are we listening to, and how is that decision made?
The developer is required to submit these reports with an ISA certified arborist. So the arborist would likely be the one submitting these tree protection reports and soil volume standard reports. And so those those root protection zones, I believe it's related to the drip line, right, Todd?
It's actually related more to the size of the trunk of the tree,
Mhm.
because drip lines can vary so much. So to standardize that, it's based on a radius from the trunk based on the size of the trunk of the tree.
And it's a ISA best management practice to establish those root zones. So it's a standard for ANSI, right?
Yeah. More or less, yeah. I mean, there's not one single standard. It kind of can vary by region, but in our region, this standard that's proposed in the code is really pretty well established as a best practice in the Portland region. But one thing I did want to point out was you had mentioned about if there's a disagreement between the developer's arborist and the city's arborist. There's actually specific language in the code when there are those types of disagreements that the city's professional would prevail in those disagreements. And that was a specific request by the tree board, as I recall, to make sure that it was explicit that the city had the authority to interpret their code to make sure that the standards are met.
Perfect, thank you. And then soil volume standards. So I think the picture on the right really illustrates this, in that when a tree is given the appropriate soil volume, it can grow to a much healthier and larger size than potentially being constrained. And this is also an issue, you know, we can walk along Main Street in downtown Milwaukee and you can see where soil volume was not meeting the needs of the tree. So the soil volume standards requires that appropriate soil volume for new plantings are met, and this is to increase their long-term chance of success. So it's 1,000 cubic feet of soil volume per tree planted. And then, you know, when submitting the development review, or sorry, the packet for the arborist to review, a soil volume plan must be included, and the methods and specifications must be consistent with ISA best management practices. ISA being the Institute or the International Society of Arboricultural, which is the, you know, the gold standard. And then the project arborist must verify that the soil volume plan was successfully implemented prior to the tree planting.
I'm sorry, is there a standard? Because you say 1,000 square feet cubic, I could give it 1 by 1 by 1,000, right? 1,000 feet deep and 1 by 1, 1 foot by 1 foot, or is there actually a standard of what that is?
I mean, if they were to preserve, I guess, you know, it would have to be reviewed by our arborist, and an arborist would have to sign off on the report that a tree would grow well there. So I guess if an arborist were to sign off on, say, 100 feet by, you know, 10 feet by 1 or whatever, our arborist, as Todd mentioned, could just say, no, we disagree, and then I prevail on this decision. You need to change it. So there is that review that's in there, but I don't know if that's common.
Yeah, and just to jump in, the default standard is a 3-foot depth of soil. So then that you know, you take your area based off of a 3-foot soil depth assumption, unless the arborist determines that based on site-specific conditions, there's a deeper or a more shallow volume of soil at that particular site. But 3 foot is the standard depth.
And just to chime in as well, Greg, I had the exact same thought, and there is provision in the code, I think it's page 11, where it says the soil volume areas must be in contiguous and within a 50-foot radius of the tree to be planted. So there's some sideboards on that.
And that's also why, you know, we're having them submit this full report with inventory and plan for our urban forester to review, because, you know, we'll bring it up to the developer if this is not appropriate. But this is also highlights why maybe some trees fail in the long run when trees are the last thing considered on a site development, because sometimes you are stuck with these really weird stretches of soil. Great. Perfect. So that was the development related tree removal. So we have those standards set out, and then when they can't meet those standards, there's a mitigation fee. There's full reports that are required to be submitted, and there's a review from both the developer's arborist, but then also our urban forester. The non-development tree removal permits are much simpler. Essentially, there's a permit required if the tree is at least 6 inches in DBH, diameter of breast height, or if it's less than 6 inches, but it's on a rare or threatened tree list that we will develop. And that's trees such as, Oregon white oak, which are really threatened in our area, and they're being prioritized. And other municipalities have similar rare or threatened tree lists with unique standards, unique DBH for triggering permits. And then also if the tree was planted to meet any of the requirements in the private tree code. So this is preventing potentially a site which was recently developed with all of these canopy and preservation standards from removing trees after the property is sold or handed off to a private owner. And then there's replanting requirements if the tree removed was a healthy tree. But there are a list of approval standards, such as, if the tree is dead, dying, or hazard, if the tree is causing, if it's needing to be thinned, removal is required for thinning or for fire management purposes. There's a bunch of approval standards which don't require replanting. The only replanting requirement is if it's for thinning. Replanting is required for those approval standards, but mitigation or fees are not required. So fees are only required if it's a healthy tree removal. And this 6-inch DBH, this is something that Tree Board is really passionate about, and they believe that 6 inches is the right number. This is something that a staff looking at workload, we do have some questions and concerns just based on questioning how many permits we would be having to process with a 6-inch DBH requirement. City of Portland's is 12 inches. And Lake Oswego's, they range as well, but we just talked to their planners, and they do, I think it's 6 inches as well, but they do have quite a high volume of permits. So this is just something to consider. And that's also why I was mentioning potential staff for tree fund dollars, depending on what we're looking at. And then we also provide exceptions for agricultural trees. And this is just, if somebody has a Christmas tree farm, for example, we're not requiring permits for each Christmas tree that is cut down in the holiday season. I see a few questions.
Commissioner Hamer, would you like to get us started?
I'll let Adam go first. He already unmuted and stuff.
Oh, I don't see his hand raised. Oh, there it is.
I muted myself though. I hit mute again. Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry, going back to that slide, I just had a question. So with the permit requirements, did you say with the permit requirements, you're still required to replant, or you're not required to replant?
If it's a healthy tree removal and it's a meeting one of the approval standards where removal of a tree wasn't because the trees were too close together, there were too many trees, then there are replanting requirements. It doesn't have to be in the same spot, but you do have to replant a tree on the site.
Okay, so can we make it replanting across the board?
I think it was not, if there's thinning needed, we didn't want to require replanting because yes, then that's essentially what it is. It's across the board. If you're removing the tree, you need to replant one. It's just if it's thinning needed.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, sorry. It was kind of a confusing roundabout way to clarify.
So I'm going to use my example and excuse my language. I call them the tree of hell. Some of them refer to them as tree of heaven. So if I want to remove a tree of heaven, which is banned in the city of Milwaukee on my property, do I have to go down to the building and get a permit that I don't have to pay a fee for? Or can I just chop it down, and do I end up getting a fine because I can't prove what tree was that I chopped down? How does that work?
Great question. So that's one of the approval standards is if the tree is on the state of Oregon noxious weed list. Tree of Heaven is on the state of Oregon noxious weed list. So you would still have to fill out a permit, which is $50, just to ensure that our urban forester knows that it was on the noxious weed list and it wasn't just any tree that was cut down. Because you're right, once it's down to the stump, it can be very hard to ID. However, you do not need to pay a removal fee if it's on the Oregon noxious weed list. So it'd cost you $50 for the permit. You get approval right away, and then you can cut it down.
So if I'm understanding this right, so every tree that is removed requires a $50 permit.
It's just a permit processing fee. If it's over the 6-inch DBH set out in the code. So if it's under 6 inches, you don't need a permit.
And who measures the 6 inches? And whose breast height are you evaluating?
You know, that's a great question. I believe the standard's at 4.5 feet for DBH, and that's
Typically.
kind of the gold standard that's actually set out in our code. And we're hoping that folks take accurate measurements, but I know from firsthand experience of talking to neighbors and stuff, people cheat on that all the time. And that's going to be the hard part when it comes to compliance and enforcement.
Commissioner Sherman, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious if there'd been any discussion around trees on the state's noxious tree list about waiving the requirements for either a permit or paying the permit fee. I could see the city having some alternative standard where if it's on the noxious tree list, the fee is $0, but you still need to file that permit. I was just curious if there's been any discussion about that, because I feel like it creates a disincentive to eliminate some of these noxious trees that also are very good at spreading, which I think we would rather get them out of here than let them continue to perpetuate themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, you know, we definitely want a permit to be submitted just so that way we know. We track trees, you know, as assets within the city, and it's a great way of essentially just ensuring that it actually was on the noxious weed list. Right now, there's only 2 trees on the state of Oregon noxious weed list, and that doesn't include trees that you would think would be, like holly is not on there, but it's a great way for us to ensure that it's actually a tree that we want removed. So I think it's just hawthorn and tree of heaven. I don't know about the waiving the permit application fees. That might be even a Vera question if we're able to do that. Or if there's circumstances that we already do that in the city.
Well, I think that's something that can get covered in the fee schedule, actually. I mean, you can just have an exception in the fee schedule where a fee is not assessed for XYZ or something like that. We have reduced fees in the fee schedule for other things. So I think we could likely just handle that through the fee schedule. Yeah.
Great suggestion.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Do you want to continue, Natalie, or was there anything? Okay.
Sorry. There we go. So, and this is also in our code about low income assistance. So we recognize that, you know, there's situations where potentially a tree needs to be removed for a variety of different reasons. And we want to ensure that folks aren't disproportionately affected by removal fees, particularly if they're low income. And so this is language that we essentially have within our construction excise tax and our home energy score and our public tree code. And we're going to be copying it into the private tree code, where we're establishing a low income assistance program to the extent that the city funds are available to assist when the owner is demonstrating a household income that is at or below 80% of median household income for the Portland, Vancouver, Hillsborough area, which works in Milwaukee's favor because Milwaukee has a lower average median income than the threshold set out by the Portland, Hillsborough standard or the metropolitan statistical area. So it reached, I think I believe it's like a 60,000 for a household of 2. And there's a calculator that we will be linking. So folks, similar for our home energy score program. So folks are able to do that calculation and see if they qualify.
And is that proven through an IRS statement, or is that proven through a bank statement? How does somebody prove that to the city that may not be officially subsidized by some sort of other government agency?
Yeah, that's a great question. For our home energy score program, which is the one that I also manage, so that's what I'm most familiar with. We actually have our contractor who performs the home energy scores do that low income assessment. We do have low income assistance for our utility bills that is managed through our finance department. So when you're paying for your utility bills, they're able to essentially check a box and then go through additional checks to see if they meet that threshold for utility income assistance. But that utility income assistance is at 50% of the average median income. So this would be a higher percentage. So there's a few ways that you could do it, either through attestation forms or working with our finance department to establish this 80% median income. It's something that our city council, we brought up to them before about creating more ubiquitous standards for that income threshold. So that way we can streamline assessment from the staff perspective. You can always do an attestation as well, because, I know I personally have concerns with receiving financial documents in my email. I don't feel comfortable doing that with my staff. So we would, an attestation form would be one way that we could do it. That doesn't require financial documentation to prove it. But to be determined, we still need to work on a staff level to develop that program. Great. And then I just also wanted to tell you about some of the outreach that we're doing. So we recognize that, tree code is really important to a lot of people, and it affects all the private properties for the most part in Milwaukee. And so we're working on a pretty robust engagement informational campaign to release this fall and winter. So we've been doing outreach and engagement for the code development tied to the comprehensive plan implementation. And that's really important to us because we want people to recognize that we're looking at the tree code in relation to housing, in relation to parking. It's not something that stands on its own. It's something that's complementing these other three aspects. But we are acknowledging that there's just not a lot of information about the city's existing tree code, but then also, there's a lot of great questions around both the maintenance of trees. When should you be maintaining trees? When do I need a permit? And so we're going to be working on an informational campaign with Enviro Issues, focusing on developing a new urban forest program brand that's recognizable, but then also creating templates for informational materials such as handouts, bookmarks, one-pagers, and door hangers, signs, but then also a website and online media refresh. So creating a more streamlined process for people to search about tree code and our urban forest program on the city's website. I wanted to highlight a few things that, really stand out for successful programs like this. For example, City of Portland has the Call Before You Cut program and outreach. And that essentially is just reminding people to, if you have questions or if you're planning on removing a tree, it's better to call before you cut. And then that way staff can assist. And there's also List Plant Albuquerque. This is a great kind of more planting focused campaign, but they also have a really great message of trees are a gift from one generation to the next. So that's kind of some of the effort that we're going to be working on as a city to really develop that Milwaukee urban forest brand. Because we recognize that outreach is key to continued program success. Not only would better outreach result hopefully in a reduction in permits, meaning that people are better taking care of their trees, we're getting less trees that need to get removed, or we're fostering stewardship of trees. We're also getting that community love and passion of trees as well. And then, homeowners' best management practices and awareness are really crucial to ensuring that the trees thrive into the future. And then I like to remind people, it's just like going to the dentist, right? You go for your routine maintenance, maybe a routine pruning once in a while will save you a lot of money from avoiding a root canal down the line. So some maintenance now on our street trees and our private property trees means that you don't have to do that, maybe a more costly fix in the future, and everyone's happy. And then also we want to make sure people are utilizing the low income assistance that we're developing. So that's going to be on the horizon. We're going to be working with Tree Board in our urban forest and natural resource team to develop those outreach materials. So I'm really excited to roll those out at a farmer's market near you, and both this summer, but then also into the future. And that's all I have. And I'm happy to answer any lasting questions that you guys may have. Otherwise, I encourage folks to send me an email or email our urbanforest@milwaukeeoregon.gov email inbox. Yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Thank you, Natalie. I thought that was a great presentation, and it's been a long time coming to hear some of this. So this is great work. I believe we've got a couple questions. Commissioner Edge, do you want to start off?
Sure, thanks. So you mentioned that Lake Oswego also has a 6-inch DBH requirement. And so what is their permitting volume for tree removals? And what do you think, how would you project that would reflect what our city's volumes would be? Because we are a different, different type of geography and everything. Built environment is different than Lake Oswego. So how would you project that would affect us?
Yeah, that's a challenging one, and I don't know if Todd has any better information on this than I do. We just talked to the acting planning manager for Lake Oswego, and we actually have a meeting with the staff that are processing their permits in the first week in September. They have a different type of tiered system for their permits where it's less kind of condensed like ours is, and they have different type 1, 2, 3, depending on if it's invasive, if it's a street tree as a condition. They process quite a few. And I don't know if that's because their canopy cover is larger than ours, right? They just have more trees in Lake Oswego. And so there's more opportunity or challenges in terms of developing on those sites, or potentially if people are just removing them in different volumes. But I'm hoping to get that information from the planning staff who are actually doing those permits. I do know that they have at least over 1 FTE plus devoted just to their tree permits and processing. And then they contract out with an arborist, and they have a bunch of folks and staff who kind of jump in to assist. So I'm hoping that it's much less than that for our city. And we're hoping to do some things such as streamlining the permit application. So that way there's less maybe investigation that needs to go into each permit. But yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure if we can do a direct proportion to Lake Oswego based on our, population size, because we are a different almost, canopy.
And I think another thing to consider is the level of canopy that, like Natalie was saying. I believe Lake Oswego has maybe twice as much. Well, maybe not quite twice as much, but almost twice as much as Milwaukee does currently. So I'm sure that adds to the volume. And I think you need to look at land area, population, some of those factors. But I know that it's very significant in Lake Oswego, the amount of staff time that's dedicated to their tree permitting.
Thanks, Todd.
Commissioner Hamer, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so actually that's a great lead into my question. How much is this going to cost? We've already brought in the finance department that has to do a whole bunch of stuff. We need to have an arborist, a permitting system, the whole 9 yards, not even the initial cost, but even the yearly cost over to maintain the system. Have we tied in the permits to what this costs us? Maybe that's what you mean by, the permit system's going to pay for staff. Have we even put that concept yet together on pen and a piece of paper and see if we can budget it in our new city hall building?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's hard to estimate what the total cost would be off the top of my head. We're fortunate in that we already have an urban forester on staff. We were fortunate in that we brought that position on, I believe in 2017 or 18 is when it was formalized. We have over the last years expanded our per capita spending on urban forests, and that's directly related to our inclusion of the urban forest goals in our vision process, our climate action plan, urban forest plan, comp plan, and then also just the community input on urban forest spending. We've done community surveys, and there's general support for spending money on our urban forest. For the permitting system, this is already a software. We're going to be working with a software that we already have a contract with. So it's not like we're spending money on that system in particular. But then also, for staff time for processing permits, that's why we do have that permit application fee to recover those costs for staff to be looking and processing those permits. The removal fees and mitigation fees, those go into the tree fund. And while it's never great to get money from what you're trying to preserve going away, that's why we're also doing these planting programs and other kind of programmatic and project-based approaches, potentially with those fund dollars to give them back to the community. It's definitely, going to be a significant investment in staff time. Our urban forester will be spending time looking at these permits, and I expect that she will have quite a few on her desk each day. But that's kind of part of this comp plan implementation, is looking at what direction the community wanted to move in. And if we were ever to achieve that 40% canopy goal, we wouldn't be able to do it without increased regulation of trees in the city. Hopefully that answers your question.
Very governmentese, well put. Nice job, Natalie.
Commissioner Sherman?
Thanks, Chair Losfeld. I had kind of had a number of questions about the code itself. A first one was maybe it's a larger kind of orientation question around the new development, new residential development. I was also curious about why some of these standards and what discussions were kind of in play around maybe not subjecting folks who are doing major renovations to their property to some of these standards, or to planting standards where they might have little to no canopy, and that moment of a major renovation and needing that permit could be that place to help increase our canopy. So that was kind of maybe my first question, and maybe we could do that and then move on to the next set of questions.
So just to clarify, is the question extending the development canopy or the development standards to renovations and maybe some other kind of sites that wouldn't be triggered typically?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's, an opportunity. I'm not familiar. I need to talk with our planning department on how we know when somebody's doing those major renovations to know how we would need that review. I think one concern off the top of my head, and I haven't talked to tree board about this or other staff, would just be, concerns around cost and whether or not if that would be prohibitive for somebody potentially renovating their home and kind of the public perception of that. And I don't know if we would require, an ISA arborist soil volume report and all these other kind of standards, which could potentially be costly, but we're hoping that, when somebody's developing the site, they're making it back in revenue with these new housing units. I don't know if we would necessarily be able to make that same argument in a renovation situation, but there's, potentially opportunity for at least planting requirements and such on, these other kind of situations that don't fit easily into the development category. My question would just be, I'd have to coordinate with planning to know when that would be triggered for our urban forester to review it and be able to process the appropriate permit.
Yeah, thanks. And I think I'm thinking more about the planting opportunities as opposed to kind of the tree removal opportunities or challenges there. So I guess in terms of kind of code, a few things that I was kind of looking at, I think it's on page 6 of the code where it talks, I'm trying to find the exact reference. It talks about the natural resource zone and where trees are removed from a property abutting a natural resource zone. The natural resource zone standards apply. And I was just kind of wondering if we're getting over our skis there in terms of applying a natural resource zone overlay to a non-natural resource zone kind of property. So that was kind of one question, and I'll see if I can find exact reference. There was a similar thing, I believe it was page 11, where it talks about, I think in the inventory, or it talks about tree root protection zones from abutting properties coming into the property that is kind of being developed. And I understand that, but I think I also question, and maybe this is a question that Justin and the tree board have had in terms of our regulatory authority around those assets that are essentially offsite and how we kind of deal with those. From a biological perspective, I understand it, what you're kind of doing here, but I think I was just kind of curious about that as well.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I know that Peter Passarelli, our Public Works Director, and I will be sitting down with Justin soon to go over the code in detail. I think, there's definitely we need to run through this with the fine tooth comb to make sure that everything's making sense. I know that tree law gets very complicated, and I'm not sure if there's any protections over, if you kill your neighbor's tree by running over its root zone, if that also throws in concerns and justifications on including that within our tree construction type standards. But that's a great question, and one that I would want to check on. And then for the natural resource zones, I'm not as sure. I think it's, I guess that would be a question over if there's preemption in some of these. And I'm not sure on that. So I would have to talk to our planning staff.
And thanks. And then the other things I think I was looking at in terms of, I think it's pages 14 and 15, where it's talking about the kind of the type 1 and type 2 kind of tree removal standards. In the type 1, which is on page 14 and 15, I was wondering about, I think it's sub 4 and sub 5, whether maintenance of the tree creates an unreasonable burden for the property owner. I was wondering, like, what is our kind of clear and objective standard for determining unreasonable? And then 5, whether the removal will have a negative impact on neighborhood character and any adopted historic or other applicable design guidelines. I would recommend we strike neighborhood character, which also isn't really a clear and objective standard, unlike the other two kind of provisions there. And then on the kind of next piece, the type 2 tree removal permit, I think when I was kind of looking through those different kind of, I think they're framed as considerations, I was unclear as to whether the tree board needs to have one of these met, all of these met, a majority of these met. It just didn't feel like, again, there was kind of clear direction to the tree board for the kinds of harder decision making that they might need to make. I recognize that this is somewhat qualitative here, but as we often grapple with, I think on this commission, sometimes having some of those standards to help us make those decisions is really valuable. And I think you've done it really well in the section above. I want to kind of be clear on that. So that was just maybe a comment and question. And then last on the code was also kind of in the penalties. It wasn't quite clear if most of these have 3 kinds of penalties. I wasn't sure, are all of these penalties being assessed? Is one of these penalties being assessed? Is it a combination? And so, you know, maybe there's some and ors or mays that could probably go in play there. So those were just kind of my own pieces of feedback kind of on the code, or questions kind of about the code.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to jump in on the type 1, type 2 permit. So the non-development code language is not required to be clear and objective because it doesn't apply to you know, the construction of needed housing. So there is flexibility to have more discretionary language in the non-development piece. Now, whether that's a good idea or not, I mean, of course, that's a policy decision, you know, for you all, but there is that flexibility to have more discretionary standards in that non-development section.
Great, thanks for clarifying. That is really important. I appreciate that.
Talking to Lake Oswego, it sounds like that was a recent project that they just invested in, which was trying to create these clear and objective standards through they believe they had like a tree code committee that they were working on for this. So we can potentially take some learnings from them to kind of maybe help in some of these areas, even if it is for our own internal use.
Oh, sorry, one more thing. Scribbling through looking back on my own notes, I noticed there was the, on the fencing requirements, I think one of the fencing requirements also, it mentioned having an arborist's phone number on it. Part of where I was kind of thinking, maybe this is part of the larger outreach is, you know, might we also want to think about like a little placard that goes up and right at the curb in front of the property that says, you know, no trees will be removed, or 5 trees will be removed, and have concerns, call this number. But just kind of maybe might help on the daylighting it and it's not a code thing, it's probably more of a programmatic thing of just kind of letting folks know, yes, there might be some trees removed, but these are the ones, as part of that broader kind of community education and outreach kind of component.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that aligns really well. We do have notice requirements for our public tree code for public trees. And so we're going to be working on some signage for that, just even, you know, for city use for public trees that we're working on. So that could definitely be, we could work on really similar signage for educational opportunities even. And that's also one of the things we want to do is develop just materials, not only for community members, but also for businesses themselves. So that way they can have brochures and other handouts that explain the why.
So I actually have a question for Commissioner Sherman regarding the type 2 permits and the discretionary considerations that the tree board would review. Do you think that, because the language says, you know, right now, the draft language says may include but are not limited to these considerations. Do you think that we need some of these considerations to be formalized? And so the tree board would be directed to prepare findings about each of several enumerated considerations? Or do you think that, I mean, is that going a little bit further than what you thought? Or how are you thinking of changing this to kind of make that a little bit more toothy, I guess?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Edge. I don't, I appreciate your question because I don't know if I'd fully thought through it as you might be kind of suggesting there. I think I was just kind of in looking at it was just, you know, things like aesthetics. You know, that's a very hard one, and probably at that moment matters greatly. Who is the composition of the tree board? Is this a tree board that, you know, you could imagine a worst case scenario made up of tree hating developers, and they're cut them down. You know, of course, that's, you know, a straw man extreme example, but I think thinking about having some level of documentation and deliberation on how that decision was kind of made around whatever the criteria might be, I think could be a valuable thing. But you know, I'd be interested to hear from other commissioners as well as yourself.
Do you think that having an appeal process would ease your concern about having an adversarial tree board?
Yeah, I guess that maybe there is a question kind of baked into that around what is the tree board the final arbiter of this? I think as the code might be currently drafted, it ends and dies with the tree board. You know, there is no planning commission, there is no council, unless I might have missed something. So I think that's another interesting observation for staff and other commissioners to think about as well.
I don't know that I have answers to, you know, those questions. You know, I've thought some about, you know, who the final arbiter should be, and, you know, whether we should have an appeals process. But you know, I tend to like I try to defend like I try to defer to the DLC in matters where the DLC gives us recommendations. I would also probably defer to the tree board, but I appreciate your thought experiment of the tree hating tree board. And so, you know, we can certainly look at how the code could put some guardrails on some anomalous scenario like that, where we have a policy body that makes decisions of consequence that, you know, might fly in the face of our adopted policy. You know, I generally don't think that's a bad idea, but I don't see where that's baked into, you know, what we're proposing here. And I don't know that body should be, you know, us or council or whomever. You know, I'm not throwing that out there right now either. Just kind of the general idea of having an appeals type process.
Maybe a question for staff or consultants in terms of your awareness of appeals processes and in other jurisdictions. Have you kind of come across that, or what's kind of the current understanding of those practices, if any?
So my experience is it can vary. It depends how you define it in your code. For example, City of Portland, their Urban Forestry Commission, the decisions, as I recall, they die there, you know, so that's the end of the road, you know, at the City of Portland. In Lake Oswego, the decision, it goes actually to a design review board first. And then that kind of serves as their tree board, but you can appeal that to the city council. So the city council is the final decision maker. In Tigard, you know, the end of the road is the tree board, or actually the parks board in their case. So it depends how you want to structure that process, but it can go all the way to the city council. That's not uncommon for an appeal process.
I just throw out there that I'd support that appeal going to city council.
Okay, Chair Massey.
Thank you, Chair Losebell. I guess I'm
Oh.
I guess I'm a little bit concerned about what I would describe as inventing a solution in search of a problem. I'm not convinced that this is going to be an issue ever. And I guess if it becomes a problem, then, we solve it then. I just kind of think that we're building in more bureaucracy than might be needed.
Yeah, sorry, former Chair Massey. I agree with that sentiment that we may be making more of this than it truly is, at least at this point for the city of Milwaukee.
Sure.
Natalie and Todd, that is a good bunch of comments and suggestions, recommendations. It feels at this point we should probably move on with our agenda. Do you have anything?
I would just say that we still need to sit down with Justin and our city attorney to run through the code as well in more detail. So I'm sure that some of this stuff will have to be revised and potentially picked through just to make sure that it's aligned with our existing code, and especially around tree board and other kind of bodies serving in a approval capacity.
Right. And Commissioner Hemer, you still have your hand up. Is there something we didn't get to?
I have one last question. In the definition of tree, how come it doesn't say planted in the ground?
That's a great question. I think that might also be one of those situations where I guess somebody.
Because I could put one in a pot out in the middle of a development somewhere, right? And it would still be considered a living woody plant characterized by one main stem or trunk that could grow to the height of 16 feet at maturity. So I would love to see in that definition planted in the ground.
Commissioner Sherman, do you want to add to this? Separate question.
Separate, yeah.
Looks like Natalie's making that note, Commissioner Hemer.
Writing it down.
Commissioner Sherman, do you want
to? I just, since we were kind of transitioning, just wanted to say thanks to staff and the consultant team and all the volunteers on the tree board that have been working hard on this. As you mentioned, Chair Losfeld at the beginning, like this has been a process to kind of get here, and this is really a major milestone. I just wanted to take an opportunity to just acknowledge that and thank everybody for their hard work before we closed out.
Great. Thank you both. I appreciate it. And Courtney as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, if you have any questions, please reach out to me or Peter, and we'd be happy to meet and chat about your suggestions and comments and feedback.
Great. Vera, does it make sense for us to move on to the second portion of our work session?
Chair, before we move on, may I make a statement? Right, torn between two lovers, being played like a fool. I've made this before. So if anything, I am consistent where I believe in people's property rights. And I believe that there's a cost issue that is associated with this that may not have yet been really thought out yet. So on the other hand, I understand the importance as a hippie myself of the urban forestry canopy and how important it is really to the livability and viability of a city. So I just want to make this blanket statement, is that I'm going to lie neutral. And I'm glad that we're doing so much public outreach, because I think that it should be really actually taken to a public vote. But I will weigh the negative reactions or the people that don't want it versus the people that do want it in public comment, and I will make my decision based off of public comment. So if you've ever heard anybody ever say that, I truly mean it, and I want the public to know that. So I want everybody to be involved in this process so that at least I can take account to know which way to vote. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great. Vera, let's move on then to the second work session item is another part of the comprehensive plan implementation project. Senior planner Vera Coles will present information about the draft code and map amendments for discussion. Take it away, Vera.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Todd. And thanks to Courtney for coming. Appreciate it. So the next part of this discussion is to talk about the design and the development standards as proposed in the code amendments. Marcy McAnally is here to present with me. She is with Herbsworks and is part of the consultant team that helped us craft all of this code and work with us with CPIC over the last little more than a year. So I'm going to share my screen and get over to the first part of the development standards. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, great. So starting off with just sort of the general development standards here with this slide with the lot sizes. Under the existing code, the standards limit the form and the type of housing within our existing zones. This table generally summarizes what are currently permitted on lots of certain sizes because that's how the proposed code is laid out or is organized around lot sizes and then the associated housing type that would be permitted. So you can see here in the table that we don't allow very many housing types on lots of certain sizes. You really need to get over, in fact, it's really over 10,000 square feet where you can get to the duplex part. But the majority of our zones and our lots only allowed a detached single dwelling or a detached single dwelling with an ADU. And in the proposed code, we are proposing to expand that to starting with minimum lot sizes of 3,000 square feet. And then you can see sort of the ranges of lot sizes and the types of housing that would be permitted. This is in alignment with our comprehensive plan goals and policies to expand housing choice throughout the city, as well as being in compliance with House Bill 2001 that establishes what those minimum lot sizes are for certain middle housing types. So up to the duplexes need to be permitted on any lot that also permits a single detached dwelling. And then 5,000 square feet is sort of our minimum for triplexes. And then 7,000 square feet is the minimum for, then we add quadplexes and cottage clusters as we build on those lot sizes. So the proposed code is organizing our permitted housing types around the lot size, as opposed to the zones themselves, as we've talked about in previous discussions. Let's see if I can, advance the slide. As part of the proposed design standards, this is an example of a duplex. We are proposing that the code allow those housing types to be stacked, attached side by side, or detached on a lot to provide more flexibility for the site design. The other design standards, of course, still apply, like setbacks, maximum lot coverage, building height, those sorts of things. But the idea is to allow some flexibility for the overall lot design. And this would apply to triplex and quadplex units, as well as the example here of the duplex. We're going to move on to the first part of the design standards, which is around the 1 to 4 units. So single unit, duplex, triplex, quadplex, but we're calling them sort of 1 to 4 units to account for the multiple ways that those might be arranged on a lot. I'm going to turn this over to Marcy in a second, but I just sort of wanted to provide an overview that currently the code has design standards for single family dwellings and duplexes, and that's in section 505.1. And that section also includes design standards for garages and carports. We also have design standards for multifamily or multi-unit housing. And then we have separate code sections for cottage clusters and townhouses as well. In the proposed amendments, and this is what Marcy is going to talk about, and this was included as in a summary format in the staff report, is a universal set of design standards that would apply to all middle housing. I'm going to let Marcy take over from here to walk through these ideas and some more information. So Marcy, take it away.
Thanks, Vera. Hello, Chair Losfelt and members of the Planning Commission. Can you hear me okay? I think, okay. I've been watching the tree code for quite a while and I may have lost my voice while I was waiting. So I'll just pick up on the last few bullet points of this slide before we move to the next one. I want to reiterate that we do have these new standards that we have written to be compliant with House Bill 2001. They're specifically for cottage clusters and townhouses. And some of them, for example, the common courtyard requirement for cottage clusters, they're very similar to some of the multi-unit or formerly called multi-family standards that you have. And we thought rather than just plunking down these new cottage cluster standards that we ought to take a kind of holistic look at all the standards that you have and see how they could be potentially merged and clarify applicability and have a universal set instead of these kind of patches. So if I could have the next slide, please, Vera. So this page it's a further development of a sample example table that was in your packet. This actually does lay down the applicability of each of these standards. And can we see the whole image? You might have to reduce it. Yeah, so we have, this is the full set of standards. Once we have merged the multi-unit standards with the new cottage cluster standards with some of the existing and new townhouse standards. And I'll just read them down from the top. I'm sure you're very familiar with these. Articulation, eyes on the street, main entrance, detailed design. These are the ones that have applied to single dwellings, and they would, the original idea was to extend those to 1 to 4 dwelling units. Townhouse, transitional space, excuse me, which is a townhouse kind of specific standard. Private open space, public open space, pedestrian circulation, vehicle and bicycle parking, privacy and screening, recycling areas, and sustainability. So the ones that I just read out are those that apply to multi-unit development now. But because we are talking about, as Vera just showed in the illustration, we're talking about 1 to 4 units, townhouses and cottage clusters. That's all the housing types of that encompass middle housing. And they can be detached, attached, stacked, attached on their sides, attached one behind the other. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that we expect to see these developments come in. And in many cases, there will be things like private open space and public open space. And we felt that the multi-unit standards have some very good, clear and objective standards in them, and that those should apply to all middle housing. But it would be somewhat unusual, I think, although most cities in Oregon are doing the same thing, to apply some of these standards to the most simple residential development. But that's the approach that we're taking. The applicability table, the table here is used to denote applicability of each of these standards, both to the housing type, whether it's a 1 to 4 units, or it applies to cottage clusters, or it applies to townhouses. And it also helps explain, does it apply to the entire site, or does it apply to just the dwellings facing the street? So for a cottage cluster, that would mean that it applies to the cottages facing the street, and then the cottage cluster public open space standards would apply to cottages facing the common courtyard. So there's more detail. There will be more detail in the amendment, but this is the general approach.
Vera, this is Robert Massey. I hate to break in, but is there a way to expand this view? It's kind of hard to read.
I think so. Oops. Hold on. Let me see. Sorry. I know Marcy wanted to kind of show
maybe marquee zoom, maybe under zoom, there's a marquee tool where you can,
no,
oh, there we go.
Is that helpful? I know I need to zoom. I think I need to actually zoom in. This one page is difficult to read, I know, because it's a whole sheet. So I don't know if does that help at all? Let's see.
If you can just,
That's easier to read.
Is that
yeah,
better? Okay.
maybe frame it so that they can see all of the
There.
numbers. I think they go to 5
Yeah.
at the bottom.
Yep. There we go.
Okay.
Is that okay? All right. Next. That.
So the applicability of these standards to remodels or expansions will remain the same. And just as a reminder or an overview really of how that works, expansions that add less, let me back up for a moment and say that expansions are probably going to be a way that many people, especially homeowners, take advantage of the new rules and build an additional unit. That's a very likely scenario. So expansions are important to consider. They're not going to change, however. So expansions that add 75 square feet or less to the street facing facade are exempt from the standards. But then there's another threshold between 75 square feet and 200 square feet. And this is the facade area. The eyes on the street applies to the new portion only. Above 200 square feet, the expanded facade area that is created must meet the standards of eyes on the street, main entrance, and articulation. Expansions are not subject to detailed design. However, anything that is done cannot increase the degree of non-conformingness. And then for attached garage conversions, again, if somebody wants to convert a garage to an additional, say, dwelling to make up a duplex, or even to become part of what is a cottage cluster, the design standards would only apply to the street-facing facade of the garage. And if the garage conversion creates a new main entrance, the main entrance standards would apply.
And if I could just jump in, I just wanted to kind of just confirm or clarify that these code standards apply now in our single unit and duplex design standards. So this isn't new, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware that we were pulling this, continuing to pull this over for any remodels or expansions. And again, these are all focused on the street facing facade. And that's how our current code is laid out right now.
Vera, can I ask real quick? Does
Yeah.
this include flag lots and back lots as well?
It does. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is not an exemption for those in our code. Yeah. Okay. Move on. All right. On to townhouses. Okay. Just want to take a minute to sort of talk about townhouses sort of generally as a background a little bit first. We haven't talked about them yet in the code in these code discussions. So the city currently does have code language around surrounding townhouses. It was adopted in 2012 when the all the residential design standards were adopted. We have not had any townhouses built to date, and the reasoning behind that, I think, has something to do with some of our design standards and our minimum lots width standards. So we have not seen any built to date. This photograph that you see here on the slide is a triplex that wanted to be row houses in the historic Milwaukee neighborhood, but it could not be. The standards didn't allow for it to happen because the minimum lot width of 30 feet made it impossible to meet the standards because of the width of the actual lot itself. And then there were issues with the way our standards relate to garages. But this is an example of what turned out to be a multifamily triplex, but could very easily have been row houses. So again, row houses on their own, or townhouses, sorry, on their own lots as an ownership opportunity. But I just wanted to show this as an example that this development originally wanted to be townhouses. The proposed standards that Marcy's going to talk about are a combination of the large city model code coming out of House Bill 2001, and then some design modeling and recommendations that her team has been working on. And then just a reminder that the House Bill 2001 requirements for townhouses are that there is a minimum lot size of 1,500 square feet and that the minimum street frontage is 20 feet. So that's right out of the House Bill. So we move on. All right, Marcy, do you want to take it over from here?
Sure. So a new thing that will be happening as a result of these amendments and having to comply with House Bill 2001 is that you may see townhouses in the medium density zone where you didn't permit those before, but wherever, in order to comply with House Bill, these need to be permitted anywhere. There will be a land division required, however, and that will probably prevent them from happening, in a great number. But we've also done a few things to your code within the areas that we're allowed to within compliance for House Bill that I think mitigate some of the worst effects of townhouses in areas where I think personally they're not suitable. So the wall-like effect where you have a long row of townhouses, I think is so different from most single dwelling detached areas that we wrote in a provision that only 2 are permitted to be attached in the R mod zone or the medium density zone. You could still have a row of them, but they need to have space in between pairs. And that is to allow them to have a shape, size, and siding that would be similar to detached single dwellings. Now, they'll still have to meet the height requirement of the base zone or limitation, the height limitation. They'll still have to meet all of the front and rear and side setbacks, but as a little pair of townhouses, they can do that. And the benefit then is that you're creating 2 home ownership opportunities on a lot that would have formerly only permitted 1 in a shape that's very much like a single dwelling home. Let's see, there was another issue, I think that is hard for neighborhoods to tolerate lots of townhouses, and that's the frequent spacing driveways. There are a number of reasons why we probably want to prevent that from happening. One, you need the street trees to help contribute to your canopy. We are also trying to increase the opportunity for parking on the street because parking will be important. And if you can prevent driveways from being too closely spaced together, you can preserve that curb space or that space. I say that because you have a lot of unimproved streets, but the space in any case between driveways will allow you to park or allow you to save trees that are on the street. So we did a little test, and I'll just continue on and talk about this slide. And maybe you need to just pull the image up a little bit there. Thanks. There are a number of different ways that you could see this type of dwelling in a medium density zone. These are, say, taking the top of 50 by 100 foot lot that's been divided into 2 and has 2 attached row houses, each on their own lot with a shared driveway. Very much looking like a regular house, but actually accommodating 2 households. Similarly, on 100 by 100 foot lot, you could do the same thing. The standard we're trying to maintain is that distance, a minimum of 24 feet between driveways. There are also ways to share parking behind the dwelling, which is what that 3rd example shows. Now I want to show one more example of our testing because we actually have an additional consideration for you, and that is So I've said that we're limiting the number of townhouses in the medium density zone that can be adjoining in order to not allow the wall-like effect of multiple townhouses together. And what we've looked at is that maybe the standard ought to be not the number of townhouses that are attached to each other, but rather the total width of the building. And if you look at the lower right drawing, you'll see on the upper portion that there are actually 3 townhouses there. These are Philadelphia style townhouses. You can do row houses or townhouses that are 12 feet wide, and they're quite livable. And in this case, if we did that, or you did 15 feet, you would still have an overall width of a house, of a shape that's still less wide than many houses that are going in that are single dwelling today. So we'd just like to put that out there as a additional consideration and a refinement to the amendments that we've proposed, that we should consider. I think the next slide actually says it, a maximum width of 36 to 40 feet rather than limiting it to 2 townhouses. So that's the townhouse section. How do we want to take any comments?
Yeah, I think this is a good time to pause and see if there are any questions about sort of the overall direction of the amendments, but also to this sort of key question that we've put forward with this idea of having a maximum width of the townhouse development in that medium density zone, as opposed to the limitation of the number of townhouses. And maybe I'll stop sharing and we can come back to the screen if certainly if needed, but thoughts about that?
We've got a couple hands raised. Commissioner Koshrovati, would you like to get started?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I actually just wanted to say that I like that idea of the width as opposed to the number because of the limitations. I feel like, middle housing is a big deal. Obviously, we're talking about it now, and maximizing, the availability, it would be key. So I do want to say I do like that idea, and I do appreciate the presentation so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, and I know there's more questions, I just wanted to jump on to what Commissioner Kozarbati just said, that generally, and I review a lot of the single unit dwellings as the permits come through, and they are at least 40 feet wide when you're looking at what their street, there's actually a house under construction right now on 32nd Ave that's closer to, it's almost 58 feet wide. So, from a scale perspective, this idea of a width makes a lot of sense in keeping with what single unit homes are, being developed at right now, as far as that width goes. So I just wanted to put, from a kind of ground truthing that width, it from a scale perspective, it's certainly in keeping with what single family or single unit dwellings are being constructed as right now.
Commissioner Edge?
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a great way to handle that. We should really be looking at how we're regulating form and, not putting excessive constraints on the number of limitations that, can be put into a space. On that theme, I'm kind of wondering, what's proposed here, how much more, I guess, aggressive in trying to satisfy the middle housing objectives are we being than the large city model code prescribes in terms of, what types of, structures or dwellings are allowed on different lot sizes, different minimum lot sizes?
We're very much in line with the large city model code, which is the more permissive of the 2 documents. The only thing that I'd say there's really one place where there are 2 places where we're not going all the way that the large city model code does. However, we're going all the way that the OAR requires us to. And that is, as I said, the only 2 attached, or if we go with this other number, a certain maximum length is allowed within the RMOD zone or the medium density zone. that is a Milwaukee specific standard. And, but believe me, Vera and I have sat in on all these DLCD open forums where all of the cities participate and talk about the issues they're struggling with, and all the cities are struggling with the same issue. So I feel that we have come up with a very sound solution, also one that will maintain the goal of allowing home ownership options on smaller lots in areas where they're previously not permitted. So that second change is the minimum spacing between driveways. We are maintaining that. And that is not actually something that's spelled out in the large city model code, but I think it's very important.
Agree. Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay.
I definitely agree with that, Marcy. I also agree. I like the way this direction is headed with the width requirement, and I'm glad to see that you're thinking about the driveway spacing as well. Commissioner Hamer?
Yeah, so I'm a little confused about the eyes on the street and the driveway examples. I like the width idea. That's great. But the driveways then coming into the back. So your front, I'm assuming that the little tan buildings that we saw in that drawing, those are garages or parking canopies or whatever we want to call them, right? Covered parking at some point in time. But then your front entrance would be facing the street. Do we have a requirement that your front entrance must be connected to the street through a paved path?
Yes. For the townhouses, they'll have to meet the eyes on the street, the main entrance, and just like a single dwelling does today.
So there has to be a paved, right, your driveway counts as your path to your door. Do you have to have a concrete path to your front door or some sort of path to your front door from the street? Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up. The pedestrian circulation standard that we're merging into the middle housing universal set comes from your multi-family standards right now. It's not, as you can picture, it doesn't apply to a single dwelling today. I mean, and we think it is important to apply to middle housing, which means that by extension, it will apply to single dwellings too. But yeah, that is an important standard. And I think it's important for townhouses for the reasons that maybe you haven't said, but I'm thinking that you're going there. Is that...
I'd rather not have a path to every door, I guess, is kind of, I'd rather have the path go up the driveway and then a path just cut across the lawn that can reach every door. Because don't forget in your picture, if you have a 1,500 square foot lot, it's going to be very hard to get 40% tree canopy in it. So you need as much lawn space as possible. And so I'd encourage as much vegetation area as you could over a concrete path, I guess. That's why I was asking that question.
So if I understand what you're describing, it's a path to the doorway, but not necessarily a duplication of a path to the street if a driveway is already there.
Right, you just have a path that you can walk up the driveway, take a path to the next driveway, and it will hit everybody's front door.
Okay.
Marcy, I just have one question for you. If you could go back to the presentation, how close is that image with the orange houses to it hitting that 28-foot minimum distance? Maybe the next previous slide.
Do you mean the example that, so that does not, this is an example of what we don't want to see especially in the medium density zone. These driveway spacings do not comply.
That's right. I was just trying to gauge how close they were. But okay, I think we just have maybe one more question from Commissioner Sherman. We can move on.
Thanks. Could you actually go back to the, not that slide, but the other one with the kind of the mock-ups?
Sure. Okay. All right. These ones?
Yeah, yeah,
mean-
and yeah, exactly. And I think just maybe building on Commissioner Hemer's comments about the pedestrian path and thinking about like how are you getting to 40% tree canopy on this? I don't want, maybe I'll sound like a broken record here and apologize to my fellow commissioners, but you know, just see in the upper right so much space dedicated toward parking. And if we're talking about this in the RMD zone, you know, when you're looking at our proposed comp plan map, like we're talking about places that, you know, generally have good access to transit. So, you know, a hard requirement for one parking spot per dwelling, like I understand we're trying to balance a number of things here, but just thinking about that space could be used for trees, for backyards, other sorts of things. I just felt like it was really incumbent to point that out as we're looking at some of these options, which we're all saying we're pretty supportive of. But it seems like we could get so much more benefit if we were willing to not require parking, although the market will probably continue to build parking because some people will want to buy that. So I just wanted to kind of make that point. Thanks.
Sorry, real quick.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Kashrabadi.
Really sorry. Real quick, actually, thank you, Commissioner Sherman, for bringing that up because it just made me think that what if, could you do something where it's like, if, you know, if a 40% canopy cannot be reached due to the current design of the parking, then you have to start removing the requirement in lieu of, I guess, you know, or like he said, just reduce or remove the requirement altogether.
Yeah, this is something that we're, sorry, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, is that we've been trying to figure out within the code how to create these incentives and how, you know, where I feel like I keep just talking about trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off and sort of, you know, what do we need? What do we want? And we can, you know, build things into our parking modification process and include tree preservation as one of the criteria for reducing the parking. It still requires that application process, to be fair. So it's not sort of a by right reduction in that respect. And so it is something that we're trying to figure out how can we create that incentive for tree preservation and prioritize that over on-street parking in a way that doesn't, you know, just keep adding to this parking modification application, which we always have that ability to do, but trying to make it work, have it be clear and objective, figure out a way to, you know, because there certainly is a case by case, you know, way to make that decision, as you've suggested, but trying to make it work sort of universally and have it be universally applicable to any situation. It's just something that we're continually, and we're going to be sort of kind of struggling with that a little bit in trying to make that work. We're all on the same page. I'm just trying to figure out how that code could actually be written so that it can apply kind of across the board. It's a great question, and we've been thinking about it a lot.
Commissioner Edge.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Adam, were you?
I just wanted to say one last thing. The 40% canopy should supersede parking requirements.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Edge,
Yeah. So, what of these development types have a pre-application conference requirement?
So the way our code is written right now, a type 2 or a type 3 land use application and higher has a requirement for a pre-app conference. It can be waived by the planning manager, but you know, all of these developments that we're talking about through here, these are by right developments. The parking modification, you know, generally would be a pre-application conference requirement because of the level of analysis that's required. Yeah.
But a row house or townhouse development would be new and would require a land division.
Correct. It would.
and would also then require a pre-application conference, right?
Well, the Senate Bill 458, that's been passed, that we talked about at the last work session,
Yeah.
is going to require, these expedited, basically kind of it's an expedited, practically a by right sort of thing, I think. And we're still trying to figure out how our code, through our land division code, can accommodate that right now. It's basically, it'll just be a partition as opposed to a subdivision. But yes,
I'm just wondering
where are you going with that?
What
May
our
I ask?
opportunities? Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what our inflection points are in terms of being able to get the idea in front of an applicant, a prospective developer of the site, that the parking modification is available and they should go for it. Or, we don't want to wait until someone goes through and gets plans readied and then submits plans. We want. I mean, ideally, we're going to get to them earlier, and that's usually what a pre-application conference can do when it's required. But in cases where it's not required, what do we do in order to get these ideas in front of them that they can find out that, oh, if and I guess if it's a needed housing, clear and objective, situation, how do you even track into a parking modification under that circumstance? You're either choosing to go into a discretionary review or you're doing something by right, in order to do needed housing. And so our needed housing statutes need to reflect that ability to get below one space per unit, so that we can accomplish what we're talking about here. Because if someone can come in and do townhouses on a site like this and just pave over the whole thing because they want to put the parking in the back, which is awesome to put the parking in the back, but then there's all your natural surface in order for runoff and any tree canopy coverage and everything. And so how do we get into that kind of fast track objective review and inflect them to take a different option, perhaps, or at least know that the option is available. So I'm kind of struggling with that and how we would approach that with the code, because needed housing, the needed housing statute should serve a purpose, and it shouldn't be like, oh man, not another needed housing application. We can't get these policies, satisfied. It should be, that's just something we have to do. It's just part of the cost of doing business. And so part of that should be that, we're continuing to get needed housing as well as meeting these policy objectives. And so I'm just wrestling with that, and how do we clearly and objectively get a parking modification done?
Right.
Commissioner Hamer, did you also have a comment?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that when I'm thinking about this correctly, right, that we've eliminated the need to actually have to build a garage in this new code, correct?
Correct,
Yes.
because your driveway would count as your parking space.
Right. So
yes.
so if we look at that, and so I'm going to push back a little bit on Commissioner Edge's idea, and probably Commissioner Sherman's idea, that a parking spot should not be required on a site. And my logic of it is tripping over cords on a sidewalk. So if vehicles are going to be going hybrid, they're going to need a place to park to be able to plug in. And so if we don't offer that onto that site, then you're going to have extension cords running all over the place. And so I think one parking spot per dwelling is fairly reasonable. Most of these dwellings are going to have at least two vehicles to them. And so you can require one parking spot, and then the other ones could be parking on the street. Don't forget, and in my mind, the way that I look at it is that every dwelling has two vehicles to it. So you're not only talking about 1-to-1 ratio, but you're talking a 2-to-1 ratio onto the parking, which once you start putting in driveway, or once you start putting in infrastructure and what's around that built environment and the way that our streets are built, it's going to be impossible to be able to pass through those streets. So that's just my feeling. And I like the idea that we don't have the garages because then that gives you that extra space in that one picture that we looked at.
Commissioner
Yeah,
Sherman?
but I don't want to make code based on anecdotes, Commissioner Hamer. I want us to actually use real data. And so, what is the vehicle adoption, or what is the vehicle ownership rate for townhouses, and what's the adoption rate for electric vehicles among those households? And how big of a problem is this over the next 20 years? I don't think that, sorry to interrupt, but I take issue with using anecdotes to make code.
I don't think that you're an anecdote. I think that the data is going to tell you that every major car manufacturer is making a plugged-in vehicle now, and that the government is going to require every vehicle to be a plugged-in vehicle. And if you are under the assumption that the only people that are buying townhouses and row houses and those are people without vehicles, I think you're making a very bad assumption. We are not in the Jetson age where we're going to have flying cars. I know that you want to think that we're going to have drivable cars that are going to zoom around the city. The satellite capabilities and the engineering alone make that impossible for another 50 or 60 years. So let's look at what the reality is. The reality is that electric vehicles are going to be coming. The manufacturers are making them. And so instead of having extension cords spread throughout the city, we should at least allow one parking spot per dwelling.
And Commissioner Hemer, I think in some regards I'll agree with you. I think that the point that I would probably take is around the difference between allowing a parking spot and requiring that parking spot be built. I think that, again, from a very, very much a free market perspective, I think developers would continue to build those parking spots specifically because they know that some people are going to want to pay extra for that. Whereas, a row house a set of row houses on 32nd or down by the Max, like you might not actually need that. And a developer might say, we're going to develop something slightly different because we're targeting, the folks that don't want to own a car. And it's not us, the city, saying, nope, but you got to still build that parking spot. And that's how the requirement is kind of structured. I was reading something for work today, just on the topic of parking, where in New York City, because people bought a bunch of cars during the pandemic, there's now some parking garages that they're talking about selling parking spots off for close to $400,000 a spot. And we have, based on the parking inventory study, we have ample supply on the street. So I think I agree with you in terms of there are going to be people that are going to continue to drive. I think the evidence that we have at hand suggests there's ample on-street space, and we know the market will still continue to provide that for the people who want to pay extra. But should we be requiring them to build it when we do have these other goals around housing and around trees? That's, I think, maybe my point is on that requirement kind of piece.
Okay, I want to keep us moving forward. Marcy, can we continue your presentation?
Yes. I'm going to talk about cottage clusters next.
Okay. Cottage clusters. All right. So just to sort of remind us all, what is a cottage cluster and what are they about? So generally, and you see some photographs here of some different developments of cottage clusters. They're detached and attached homes, and they're clustered around shared open space. Parking is often grouped in a little parking lot. They're small in size, the cottages themselves. They can have shared resources or amenities like a garden or a common building or a workshop, something like that. And the units can be on their own lot or they're all on one single larger lot. Related to this, as far as the House Bill is concerned, House Bill 2001, so cottage clusters need to be permitted on lots over 7,000 square feet, wherever they are. The building footprint is limited per the House Bill. Lot coverage and maximum density do not apply We may not apply those standards to cottage clusters. The design standards for the cottage clusters are addressed in the large city model code. And there's a reason why the House bill, I think, has pulled this out as a very specific type of housing and has really emphasized cottage clusters because it is a really important housing type, especially for addressing housing attainability and lower cost housing. In Milwaukee, again, 2012 was a magical year. We had our cottage cluster code adopted, and we've had none built to date. Our cottage clusters are not permitted in our lower density zones, similar to townhouses. So we've had interest in them, but the lots where a cottage cluster could feasibly work under our current code, those lots generally do not exist in our higher density zone. So we haven't had any built yet, but we've had a lot of interest. So the proposed standards that we are going to be talking about are a combination of the large city model code, the cottage cluster feasibility study that the city did in 2019, and then of course design modeling and recommendations from Marcy's team. And then you can see here on this slide the intention of the code amendments to promote this market rate provision of homes that are affordable to households that are different incomes and different sizes, and to encourage design that balances private outdoor space and shared outdoor common area. And again, promoting community building within a housing cluster and with the surrounding neighborhood. So it's a really important, I'm really excited to kind of see how we might be able to get some cottage clusters in the city. We've had a lot of interest even of late with this whole code amendment process that we're working on right now. So I'm really excited to see if we can get some. So Marcy,
Okay.
I'm going to kick it off from here.
Sure. So for Milwaukee, building upon the work that you did in 2019 with the feasibility study, we kind of went above and beyond what the House bill requires. The House bill really requires only detached cottages on a over 7,000 or over lot, small in size, and all the characteristics that Vera just went through. But we did go one step further for your city because you have been in discussion about cottage clusters for quite some time. And you had in the feasibility study some examples of attached, more densely spaced cottages. And those are in the higher density zones. So you have two flavors of cottage clusters. The one on the right in this example is the one that strictly complies. And you can see by the map the two areas where these different flavors would apply. So just to reiterate, the attached ones would not be permitted in the medium density zone. So I'm going to actually spend more time talking about the detached ones, but first we're going to show you some pretty pictures of attached ones. So most of you know Cully Green, or if you haven't, you should visit. Here's an example of it would be called a cottage cluster, but many of these are actually condominiums or townhouses, each on their own lot. And maybe I could take a moment to just explain that to meet the House Bill 2001 requirements for cottage clusters, a city only has to go as far as allowing cottages on a single lot. I think it's a more difficult solution to get to later, and I'm sure Milwaukee will do it, to allow, probably will be required to do that through the Senate Bill 458, but it would be to allow cottages on their own lots within a cluster. So just to, again, repeat, the amendments that we have before you are all about cottages on a single lot. However, Cully Green is an example of cottages on their own lots. It's in the city of Portland. And these are attached, and this is what such a development could look like. And we have some metrics here. I mean, you do get a lot more density. Cottage clusters tend to be quite dense anyway, compared with a single dwelling on a lot. However, you can get 1.5 times more density, generally speaking, when you are allowed to do some of these detached versions. So I think it is a really exciting prototype for the higher density zones. So I want to talk a little bit about this gap in the next slide. We have done quite a bit of testing to get your amendments up to where they are today on the 7,000, which is the minimum lot size, up to 20,000 square foot lots. And you can kind of tell from some of the modeling here that on a 7,000 square foot lot, it's pretty difficult actually to get cottages. However, you can get, and parking, but you can get 6 dwellings or 4 dwellings generally on these size lots. When you go up to 20,000 square foot lot, you get a lot more room to do both, to accommodate both the parking and additional cottages. And so we feel very comfortable with the amendments that are proposed right now because we've done a lot of testing and we're confident that we comply with House Bill 2001 and that we also have, where in the few areas where we can flex a little bit from the House Bill, that we've got the right standards in there. So the issue we wanted to talk to you about here was, what about these very large lots that would be like 120,000 square feet, or so close to 100,000 square feet, multiple acres. And we did some literal tests of cottage clusters that met all of the minimum standards on these lots, and I'd like to walk you through the results. First, before we go to the next slide, I'll tell you that the tests consistently looked at sites of this size. We wanted to see what the most intense development would be, and we placed no limit on the number of cottages or clusters on these lots. So the first example you're going to see is one that just meets the minimum. It's kind of a dumb, stamp out of a cottage cluster, a bunch of cottage clusters with no subtlety for dealing with the trees that exist on these sites or the topography. And again, like I said, we didn't impose a maximum. The yellow highlighted standards are the ones that we're kind of exploring. The maximum cottages per cluster that we proposed are 12. So in a cluster, a maximum of 12. And those cottages are allowed to be separated by as little as 6 feet. So of course, somebody can separate them, can put more room in between them. And that applies to both the space between the rear of the cottages or between the clusters themselves, as well as between the cottages at their sides. So we think this is kind of stingy and tight looking. And so we said, well, what if we impose a standard that there must be a separation between clusters? And one of the interesting little silent places in House Bill 2001 is that it doesn't actually say, it says that there can be no maximum density applied to cottage clusters, but it doesn't actually say that when you can't say there's a maximum number of cottages. So we went ahead and said that, but then it's also silent on how many clusters can you have, or what is a cluster? So we used this testing to go a little bit further and say, well, okay, a cluster is 12. That's what we've got in the amendments today. Should we, on these very large lots, should we allow a lesser number of clusters than shown here? And when you see the next drawing, I think you'll agree that even with some subtlety taken into account for responding to trees or trying to be a little bit more, organic in design, that 3 is still a lot. So I'd actually skip right to the next. That maybe 2 maximum on these very large lots is where we want to land. So this is the testing that we've done, and I'll let you just gaze at this kind of our end point for a moment before I walk you through what we think are our choices. And I'd be happy to answer questions at this point too. Should I go ahead and call on the people I can see whose hands are up? Commissioner Hamer?
So what defines the difference between the 2 cottages? Is it HOA ownership? Is it one person owning one chunk of property? Is it a separate piece of property? What defines the two differences between the
In this
12
case,
and this different setup?
in order to comply with House Bill 2001, this would be on a single lot. And so it'd probably be a single homeowners association that controls the common open space and the parking. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, I guess, why would they be called two separate cottage clusters then? Is it
Oh,
only
well,
because they have the same court or a different courtyard?
right, that's a good point, a good question. There's a little bit of the mechanics of following all of the standards that are in the cottage cluster ordinance. And one is that only a certain number of cottages can be kind of like not next to a courtyard. I think it's 50% of them do not have to face a courtyard. In this design, we made them all face courtyards, but there could be some that are sitting kind of free of a courtyard, you know, elsewhere, somewhere, say under that grove of trees or something on the right side. So what makes a cluster is the required number of cottages around the common green, and the common green is defined by a set of standards of minimum dimension and orientation. That once you have met those things, then you have what you could define as a cottage cluster. Commissioner Sherman.
Yeah, thank you. Could we maybe just toggle between this one and the previous one and maybe sit on that one for 30 seconds and then come back to this one?
Absolutely.
I think maybe a question that I have is maybe going back to the two clusters. And it's I guess it's relevant to that schematic as well, is what do we have in terms of setbacks on kind of property lines? And I think maybe where my eye hones in on the example on the right is the I know this property, but it's like it's the northwest corner, so the upper left corner, and just seeing that one unit looks rather close to that property line. And so I guess I was just wondering, like, what are we currently thinking about in terms of setbacks?
That's a really good question. So we are not able to really think about that because that's one of the prescriptive parts of the House Bill cottage cluster code. 5 feet is the maximum perimeter setback that you're allowed to have.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. I think in many ways, the diagram on the right, I feel like makes a lot of sense. Maybe with that exception of that one cottage in the upper left, just seems a little close. But if we also have no local control over that, then there's not much that we could necessarily do there. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Khoshrowbadi.
Yeah, I don't have a question, more of a comment. I just like to say that I'm a huge fan of the cottage clusters. And I do like, I feel like this example here with the two clusters, although it doesn't maximize, you know, putting as many units as possible, it does kind of meet that middle ground between, you know, tree canopy goals and also housing goals, while also providing, it looks like, a bigger green space for the people who are going to be living there. So I just like to say I'm a big fan of the two cluster one, because I feel like it kind of is that middle ground for a lot of the goals that we're looking to hit.
Thanks for that comment. Oh, was there someone else about to speak?
No, I just wanted to say I would second that. I like this example here with the two clusters. It feels like a good balance with livability and just scaling this solution for everything that Adam had just mentioned. I support this option over the 3 cluster option.
Thank you for that.
Commissioner Edge.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, wondering if two is like really the magic number in terms of a limit, because different sites of different sizes are going to, have, different right approaches, I guess. And I appreciate that these two, sample sites, look much more attractive, certainly from our perspective, with the two cluster option or alternative here. But, there might be other sites where that's, they could support 3 or 4 or 5. I don't know. I haven't seen an inventory of, sites that are over 20,000 square feet, in this, that could accommodate this. But I feel like 2 is while attractive here in this set of examples, is maybe not a limit that we should constrain all such developments to.
Yeah, you're.
And then the next.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you finish, please.
Okay, so then the other thing I was going to say is I also would be supportive of the idea of having attached clusters in the moderate density zones as well. So it's kind of a side note to that, but I would support that. I think that would be, these could still be reasonable with attached units. And again, we're really should be focusing on the form, and in terms of what the footprint is of the structures, and also making sure that we're getting dwellings that are modest size, to maintain affordability. So that was all on that. Thanks.
Well, so Commissioner Edge, I think you have kind of put your finger on the things that we're struggling with. So we are trying to maximize the number of cottages on these lots, because on lots generally, because it is an inherently affordable housing type. And we're also trying to, we have to abide by the rules in the House bill. Some of these standards are very minimal for the reason of wanting to keep them affordable. Developers tend to want to make these units bigger, but the House bill doesn't allow us to, because that's inherently affordable, is that they're small. I think developers tend to want to add parking to these, and that's also something that it's allowed, but it's not required. The shared parking, there are a lot of features that are kind of built into, and absolutely you have a city, they're very prescriptive built in the House bill recipe for cottage clusters. I personally feel a little uncomfortable that when we start to look at these large lots, that not all of the questions about the number of cottages have been answered in the House bill. I think the House bill didn't really anticipate cottage clusters on lots of this size. And when we have attended, Vera and I, the DLCD open forums, there's been a lot of concern amongst all the cities about lots over a certain size and the things that maybe haven't been thought about. So I think what we're trying to do here is knowing that these will be by right, and they also have to meet these minimum standards, that this is a good, this is a sound formula that you can allow without any review. If somebody wants to do 3, then maybe they do go through additional scrutiny. Infrastructure is an issue, and emergency service is an issue. I've discussed this a little bit in the staff, in my memo for the report. When you start to get more units on, it becomes difficult for infrastructure providers to be able to meet them. It may be an issue for, especially for fire access, some of these more, remote sites that are difficult to reach. So I just trying to balance those issues of infrastructure service and emergency response access, and kind of an easy decision to make that you're going to need to make allow by right. That made us come down to, well, 2 seems to be safe.
Do we need a maximum lot size, or it to complement that so that we don't get someone filling out like a really huge site with, around two large,
Yeah,
greens
that's a good question. Somebody could aggregate lots and make very, very large lots. But then again, if you have a 2 as your max, it does kind of tend to self-limit that or cut off that the desire to do that option. Commissioner Sherman.
I think I just wanted to I think while I might personally have a preference for 2, kind of based on those 2 examples, I do think 3 could also make sense. There might, in looking at that other example. So I just wanted to kind of share that thought with others, that I could see a scenario where 3 could kind of be the limit as a by right approach.
Commissioner Massey.
Yeah, Marcy, I appreciate this presentation. I like all of these ideas and a lot of good food for thought. But I keep coming back to this nagging question I have. Okay, we've had a provision for cottage clusters in the city for 9 years and haven't built any. So, whenever we have discussion about cottage clusters, I see the same 3 or 4 developments that we've all visited. Well, at least the commissioners visited. What was it, 2.5 years ago? And so I just don't have a feel. Maybe I'm living a sheltered life, but are these places being built?
I'll say that all of the home builders and developers that I have encountered in these different cities that we're working on these House bill amendments with, people who attend the open forums or the public open houses, and they're very interested in this model. A lot of affordable housing providers are interested in this model because, but it hasn't been permitted. Actually, not yet. Milwaukee's been on the leading edge, but in many cities they're not permitted. House bill will completely blow that open, and these will be permitted everywhere. So I do think you're going to see a lot of interest.
So the House bill itself will be an impetus toward the development of these, you believe?
Yes.
Okay. Because my observation in a few of these developments is they're just not housing choices. They're almost like lifestyle choices that are different from what a lot of people are used to in the single family dwelling and that kind of thing. It's more than just a house size. It's more of a communal experience in some of them, which is really interesting, almost kibbutz-like in some respects.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But a number of affordable housing providers that have attended forums and things on this housing type have said that this is actually their preferred housing type, is separate, not an apartment building, but separate structures. They'd actually prefer to have these be home ownership options as well, which will require the Senate Bill 458, compliance to allow these to be on their own lots. So those are people that aren't selling a lifestyle necessarily, just to add a different dimension to what you're saying. There are developers who are very much selling a lifestyle, and the rarity of this housing type does make it extremely desirable for those reasons. But I think the affordable housing providers are going to be all over this.
Okay, look forward to it.
Well, I will just then. Were there more comments, or should we go ahead to the last slide?
Can I just say
No, Marcy, I was. Oh, sorry.
I just want to say bless you, Vera, for your sneeze. I couldn't let that go.
Okay, now Marcy.
So the last, the next to the last slide, or we're getting close to the end. I just want to leave you with these possibilities. So related to these very, very large lots. One is, as we've discussed, imposing a maximum number of cottage clusters. That's one idea. Increasing the separation or considering that when the separation distance is increased, and it can be increased to as much as 10 feet, but you can't require more than that. It does seem to help, I think. Should you prohibit cottage clusters on flag lots or back lots over a certain area? And that would apply to, say, the example that we were looking at on the right. Is that something that, for all those reasons that I was talking about, infrastructure, service, or emergency response, maybe that is worth considering? And then another is that if you do allow these very, very large lot cottage clusters, maybe there are some additional street path connectivity requirements. Any discussion on these before we go to the next steps?
I will just say that I think that because I believe in property that they should be allowed on flag lots or back lots, and if there is a requirement that the emergency vehicles need, maybe we can build that into the. I know we don't call it a pole on the back lot, but whatever we want to call it, require that into the pole if that is necessary. But I think that is our most developable land in the city, and I can think of a couple of lots that are right in my back door that probably make the 20,000 square feet that could probably get some cottage clusters in it.
I think what
That
we
was a
might,
great suggestion.
oh, sorry. If I could, I did want to ask, because this was a question that we wanted to, that we've been talking about with Marcy as well, was this, it's related to the flag lot idea, but the idea of being able to make sure that in our code, you could incorporate the parent house into the cottage cluster on the property. So is there a way to do that so that you wouldn't necessarily have to create the flag lot at all? For example, that the Cully Green example, on one section of that development, there is a parent house that's sort of, it's the one that faces the street, and then, the rest of the cluster is sort of behind it. So is there a way to just incorporate the house into the cottage cluster or make it part of it somehow, so that we wouldn't even need to create the flag lot at all? It's an alternative. I'm not suggesting that that's the only way to do it, but that could be a way that our code standards could just incorporate that house into it, and not even get there. And then as far as the emergency access and so on, Clackamas Fire is going to have its requirements, and regardless of what our code says, if Clackamas Fire needs a certain width, or they need a turnaround, or whatever they need, that's going to happen. So I think I try not to sort of incorporate necessarily their exact standards into our code. We kind of reference them because sometimes those change. So by allowing it, that's fine, but there's the possibility that it might not work simply because of their requirements for turnarounds and that sort of thing, and those still count, regardless of what our code says. So we can always do that anyway.
Commissioner Hamer, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I like the idea about the parent lot kind of tie-in, but I guess my only question is what makes a cottage cluster versus a house with a bunch of ADUs?
The number, you can have more of them.
So how would that I guess land division wise work? Would that mean that the parent house would then have to become an HOA with the rest of the lots?
Yeah.
And that's how you separate it from it being considered a bunch of ADUs? You understand what I mean by that one?
Well, so you're going to allow 2 ADUs, right, Farah? So you could have right now, you could have 3 dwellings on a lot with your primary dwelling and 2 ADUs. However, with a cottage cluster, you could have 5 or more. And I think it's a more of a practical issue. The answer to your question, you would want a homeowners association probably. Whereas if you just had a primary dwelling and 2 ADUs, you could probably manage it, without a HOA.
And am I correct? I mean, if you were gonna, you could do the primary dwelling with 2 ADUs, and you'd be able to rent those ADUs out. You're not selling those ADUs. in order to sell those off, that's where the homeowners association becomes kind of the critical vehicle for allowing, even with those 2 ADUs, if you want to sell them, you need the HOA, unless you're able to kind of do a land division, which it sounds like maybe we're waiting on the Senate bill to allow that.
I think that's a good point.
I had a question, Marcy, for you in terms of kind of that third or the final question on your slide. Just wondering if you could kind of maybe help me better understand what you're kind of talking about in terms of kind of some of the street ped connectivity issues. If you could just help me better kind of maybe understand that issue, maybe relative to one of those examples that we showed, so we can. I'm a visual learner, so I would appreciate kind of maybe just having explained a little bit more what the issue is.
I think what we would be trying to get at is some permanent public like connections through these sites to connect to, say, transit, to connect neighborhoods to each other, open space, et cetera. So it would be requiring more of a porous, that you'd have to meet some standards for street path network that would be implemented on the site. If you did, if you were allowed to do all these cottages on the site, that in exchange you would provide something to contribute to the network of people getting around the city, because some of these sites are very strategically located.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I really appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense, and I think that I would definitely support some level of it, at the very least, kind of PED connectivity, and would also be willing to entertain street connectivity as well, recognizing though that streets, also create limits in terms of what can happen with this site. So, and I think in terms of kind of the question around a parent house and a cottage cluster, I think in many ways, like that's where I know I missed out on the discussion about my email on the topic of flag lots and back lots, but I think in many ways that's where my own vision is more towards the cottage cluster behind behind homes on large lots, as opposed to some of the other alternatives. And so I think that creating these options and making them, I think to Commissioner Massey's point earlier, really making sure that they're kind of incentivized, because the market's going to go to the low-hanging fruit. The market's going to go to flag lot for the single family that's big and can sell for, a premium price. But thinking about these opportunities to create that flexibility for more of the cottage clusters on some of these large lots, I think that's more in line with our community values and our community vision. So I'd love to see an opportunity for us to think more about that.
Commissioner Edge, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I completely just wanted to echo that. I think that, really having the cottage cluster on a back lot or a flag lot or a rear lot or whatever whatever we're calling them, that I think is something we should really be striving for. I think that's a great use of that, of those, it's kind of a lower intensity use of those back lots. And when you're abutting other people's backyards and everything, it makes sense to have a lower intensity use. And so if we can make it to where those development opportunities are available, and then the standards will, play into that and create the right incentives, then I think that's kind of a golden ticket. I feel like, it's a huge opportunity at least. And really, and this gets to the heart of the issue. I'm going to make a plug for this again. Every time we talk about it, I'm going to make a plug for this, that we really need to be allowing triplexes and quadplexes on every lot with a duplex and a single detached dwelling, because really, honestly, what we're trying to do is meet some policy objectives incrementally. And, and honestly, the more that we allow to happen on any given lot, the fewer lots have to redevelop for us to actually meet these policy goals. And we've heard from, people are afraid of change. People are afraid of their communities changing. If we can meet some of this demand, or a lot of the bulk of this demand with fewer lots redeveloping overall, I think that that should help put some minds at ease that really this is incremental change. This is going to take a long time. You know, we're looking out 20 years on this planning horizon. You know, this is incremental change, and you know, we're not trying to get it to where you have literally have a duplex built on every lot. We're trying to make it to where we can meet some policy objectives and maintain a livable city that people, you know, moved here for. And so I feel like opening up more capacity on every lot is really a key to help us manage that and actually achieve these policy goals without, you know, needing to incentivize quite as much redevelopment. The other piece of this is that you know, I'm really curious about the affordable housing bonus on middle housing and what we're able to do with that, and if we're able to maybe do more than 4 units on a lot, if those are promised and secured as affordable, those units in excess of 4. Because that tends to model really well in terms of being able to start to get at housing that can be affordable and protected and subsidized by the other market rate units on the site. And that's one thing we want to do, is we want to be promoting affordable housing types. And so I wanted to bring this stuff up again because we were talking about the minimum lot sizes. This is really important to this equation, is really opening this up to happen on every lot. And giving landowners, you know, property owners flexibility to help us meet our policy goals here.
Thank
So
you,
that's my
Commissioner
take.
Edge. Okay, Marcy, please continue.
Actually, the end of my slides. So I want to thank everybody for your very helpful comments and feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Marcy. The concluding slide is just sort of the next steps, which we kind of talked about at the beginning. So this was intended to be sort of our series of work sessions to get into the nitty-gritty of the code. And then staff's intent is to refine the code based on all of these discussions. We've been tweaking it all along. Again, posting the hearing notice and so on next week for a public hearing on October 12th. So that's the idea, that October 12th would be the first hearing for the code. But that's the end of this discussion. But thanks very much. This was great.
Commissioner Hamer, do you have your hand up for?
Yes, I do
For Vera?
actually. So I would like to discuss the eyes on the street and the main entrance on flag lots. And I think that Commissioner Edge and I think this is our last chance to say, hey, let's go a little bit more laissez-faire and allow more things on more lots, and you know, let's not restrict it by the square footage of the lot. But in a flag lot and a back lot situation, I don't think that your eyes on the street is as vitally important because I think that you actually have more room to be able to turn units, you know, onto the backside because the depth is generally bigger than the width. And so I think that there's more opportunity so that if your doors face each other instead of facing towards the street, that you can get more units in there. And I don't know how that works with the cottage cluster. Why, if we allow them in a back lot or a flag lot, why you even care what's eyes on the street? They all should be facing the courtyard anyway. So that makes really weird sense to me, and I don't quite understand the logic of that. I'm sure there is, but really on
I
a
think,
flag.
maybe we didn't communicate one important applicability. It's like the primary applicability standard is that these only apply when the closest wall of the street facing facade is within 50 feet of a front or street side lot line. That's correct, Vera?
Right. Yep. But the front lot line is actually that main lot line. It's not the one at the street. So
okay, so
they
that's
do
the
apply.
issue.
Yeah.
Is the front
No, I
lot
just
line
like
of the
it-
flag lot.
Yeah.
Right. We should allow row houses, duplexes, triplexes, whatever, in flag lots and back lots. And I don't think that they need to, if they're in that situation, eyes on this. If you want to keep it for single family dwellings, you can, but, I would suggest that would be eliminated for those.
They could be rotated 90 degrees and oriented towards the flagpole,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Commissioner Kashwabadi?
I just had a question. Going off of what Commissioner Edge said and Commissioner Hemer said, why is it that there's not duplexes allowed on 1,500 square foot lot sizes? I mean,
On-
I
On
yeah,
1,500 square foot?
yeah, because we allow the townhouses. Is there a reason why they don't allow duplexes?
Duplexes need to be permitted on any lot that a single unit detached dwelling is permitted on, and so the way we've proposed it, that minimum lot size is 3,000 square feet, and that the 1,500 square foot lots are sort of exclusive to cottages in a cottage cluster or townhouses. So is the suggestion that single unit, single detached homes and duplexes would also be permitted on 1,500 square foot lots?
I mean, yeah, I don't see why we wouldn't. But wouldn't that help affordability too? Smaller house on a smaller
Sure,
lot size?
sure. It would. Okay. That will be a key question in the public hearing, I think, October 12th, and see what the public says.
That's a good one, yeah. Absolutely.
That is a good one. That's, yeah.
Okay.
It was just,
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Greg. Commissioner Hamer.
And I just want to raise one more point, and that is, I heard what Commissioner Edge said earlier, but I think that a single family residence should have 3 ADUs, be allowed 3 ADUs. And I think what happens is that your number should be 4, right? Because once we kind of get beyond 4, then we are in a different zone, right? Than the RMD zone, except for the cottage clusters, of course. But we then we don't allow 8 plexes. So I don't think a 4-plex should be allowed to have 4 ADUs. That would be technically, right, an 8-plex. So, but I think a single family dwelling should be allowed to have 3. A duplex should be allowed to have 1 each, right? Because that'd be 4. A triplex could have 1. As long as you keep that number at 4, I think that is extremely reasonable for what I would consider as a density model.
Even if that's the key for the market to be able to help us fund additional affordable units that are protected?
I don't know if that is the key for the markets, but I think that you also have to look at livability and the current conditions as well. That if we are making a zone that is a residential zone that is built on a certain amount of density, we have a downtown core, we have other areas that are built on higher density. Look, I'm right there with you. We should have R1 up and down King Road and up and down 32nd, but we've decided not to do that. So we've created a residential zone, which means less density. So I don't think that it's fair to pack in 8 plexes and 12 plexes into a into a high, whatever it is, low density zone, into a residential zone. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair to the people that live here that have that expectation.
What if you capped it at 6 and it was the 2 units are guaranteed affordable and 4 units are market rate?
It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter. I don't think it's fair.
So you'll forego any affordable units in that scenario?
No. You didn't hear what I said. What I said is that each lot, right, or each development should be allowed up to 4 units on it. So a single family house should be allowed 3 ADUs, right?
But we're talking about protected capital A affordable housing would be the requirement.
I understand what
to go above 4.
I understand that. I think that number 4 is important for your residential zone. Doesn't matter what kind of housing it is. I think that number is 4. And I think that what you will find is that if people want to put 3 ADUs onto their single family dwelling, that they will be affordable. And so I think what you're pushing for is maximizing density into an area where it's not zoned for that maximized density. Save that for the downtown.
What I'm trying to do is leverage the private market to satisfy our affordable housing goals. That's what I'm trying to do. And I want.
Look, I am fine with that in an R1, in an R1B, and an R2, not in an RMD.
All right, I'm going to interrupt because I think we're going beyond the bounds of tonight's agenda. I'm going to give Commissioner Sherman an opportunity, and then I'm going to look to close the meeting.
Thanks, Chair Losfeld. Wait, am I muted? No. Okay, my screen was saying you're muted, and I was like, no. I think on the ADU piece, I think one thing that we just need to stay focused on is I think that in most single dwelling instances, putting ADUs means those ADUs are rentals. They're not actually home ownership opportunities. They're not being sold. That's where I think the cottage cluster kind of comes in as the key place in order to actually have those small units be home ownership opportunities. And so I think that's kind of a key differentiator that we just need to kind of stay focused on. I also, that was more of a comment than anything. And I think to one of Commissioner Hemer, Commissioner Edge's points that were just kind of made around the zoning map, I would also encourage us to actually look through the zoning map really closely and maybe consider making some other changes. And maybe the ship's already sailed and we're too far along in this process to go in and say, might we want to go rezone some properties along, the example was King Road. And I think we could think of a lot of other examples. I think what we've done is we took our zoning map that we had and we just changed letters and we changed densities, but we haven't actually gone through thinking about urban form and thinking about certain streets and saying maybe we should actually be upzoning some of these properties based on what we know now. I would really encourage staff and the consultant team to consider that. And again, maybe the ship's already sailed and we're too far, but I think that's a key part of this that we have kind of missed.
Vera, I wonder if you have a response for that.
On the zoning map question.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's accurate that we, looked at our existing residential zones, consolidated the low mod into the R mod. So we have, there they are, and then the high density, I think, and then there they are. The idea was to consolidate those as well, given their locations. They're mapped in a certain way for a certain reason, right? They're around our commercial cores. We wanted to consolidate those as well, as you all know, but we will be revisiting our high density zones as during our hubs project, and the hubs project will also include mapping as well. So it's not just sort of, it is going to be looking at, we'll be revisiting the zoning map at least one more time after this, to continue to kind of massage the map, and some of those RMOD zones would likely be affected, by that hubs review, particularly on 32nd Avenue. The NMU zone is currently only on one side of 32nd Ave. It's a nice opportunity to kind of revisit, does it want to be on the other side as well? Obviously, there's a lot more public engagement involved in that because we're really flipping people's zones around. But I mean, you're right. I think as far as kind of, I think we had approached this project with this consolidation idea in mind as a way of moving that forward. And then we will continue to massage that during the hubs and the high density zone process as well. So those boundaries will change to some extent as it reflects those projects anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Vera. I think we can move on then to other business. Do commissioners or staff have any other business at this time? Vera?
If I could, Chair Loswell, thank you. I just wanted to let folks know that Mary Heberling, one of our assistant planners, I think you all know her, has sadly will be departing the city of Milwaukee. She's been here for
Oh
5 years and
no.
has done such a great job. She's leaving at the end of the month, so next week, sadly. She's accepted a position at the city of Newburgh to be their new housing planner. So she really wanted to focus on housing. So she'll be with the city of Newburgh working on housing. So we're really gonna miss her. So
Wow.
I'm bummed. But she's been such a great team member. So I'm really sad to see her go, but I'm very happy for her for this new opportunity, new chapter for her. So it's great. So I just wanted to let you folks know that you won't be seeing her at public
And
hearings
for those of you who
anymore.
don't know, Mary grew up here in Milwaukee, and that's
She
what really
did.
made it super special.
Yeah, she did.
Tell
She's
her all
great.
of our love and
I
good luck
will.
to her.
I will. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. That's the only update I had.
Yep,
I just
she
wanted to
will be
let
missed.
folks know. Yeah, she's been terrific, really terrific. We're gonna miss her on the team. So yeah, that's the only update I have. Thank you.
Commissioner Hemer?
All right. Well, I'll make my commercials quick. I only have 16 minutes to stretch this out to. So here's the deal. August 29th is the Car Free Day downtown from 9 a.m. to 2. Check it out. It's going to be a blast. Milwaukee Historical Society is going to have a self-guided historic tour, bands, and City Hall is going to be talking about what to do with City Hall down at City Hall. So make sure that you check that out. And September 11th, performance at the museum with our locally artist, Stefano Iambati. He lives in the Welling neighborhood. He does comedy and that kind of stuff. That is September 11th. 2 shows, 1:30 and 3:30 at the Milwaukee Museum. And generally after a meeting, we get a little time to talk to each other. Joseph Edge, all my love to you, my brother. You know that even though that we fight a little bit, we still have mutual respect, my friend. That's all I got.
Okay. Let's see. I would say, do you have any other discussion items, commissioners? No more love being shared, that's fine. Forecast for future meetings?
Yes, we have that on the agenda. So the September 14th meeting is the variance for the Bonaventure Senior Living development. They have submitted a variance for their walkways to not be pervious. September 28th, tentative hearing for the Coho Point redevelopment project. October 12th will be our middle housing code. And then October 26th, we have tentatively scheduled the Hillside Master Plan Final Plan Development, and then code hearing number 2. Unless you go ahead and send a recommendation to adopt in one night, which I don't think is going to happen, but just in case, we do have a tentative for October 26th as well. So we have a lot happening over the next few meetings. So
Yeah,
it's going to be an
those are some
exciting fall.
important days. Hopefully we get some good attendance. All right, well, with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
A second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, and all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody.
Good night.
so
Thank you so
much.
much. Thank you.